Most of us learned Marco Polo the same way. A young Venetian merchant walks into a court of gold, dazzles the most powerful ruler on earth, and comes home with a story so wild that nobody believes him. We picture silk robes and jade palaces, exotic spices and dragon-emblazoned banners. We picture China as a kind of glittering fever dream, half real, half invented, filtered through the imagination of a medieval storyteller who may or may not have actually been there. But here's the thing. When you actually sit with what Marco Polo wrote, what he emphasized, what he lingered over, what clearly amazed him, the picture that emerges is deeply strange. Not strange in the way of fantasy, strange in the way of reality, that doesn't match the version we've been telling ourselves for 700 years. He spends almost no time describing the Great Wall. He never mentions tea, a society where hundreds of millions of women had their feet bound, one of the most visually striking practices in all of medieval civilization, and he seems not to notice it at all. But paper money? He is fascinated by paper money. He describes it in almost bureaucratic detail. The inks, the seals, the denominations, the penalties for counterfeiting. He writes about salt taxes and courier systems and census records with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered that an empire can be run like a machine. It reads less like a traveller's wonder and more like a consultant's report. So what exactly did Marco Polo see? And what does the gap between what he recorded and what we expect him to have recorded actually tell us? That's the question this journey is going to sit with. Not whether Marco Polo was a liar, not whether the whole thing was fabricated from start to finish, but something more interesting and more complicated than either of those verdicts. We're going to look at the context he was writing inside, the empire, the translation chain, the genre of travel literature in the medieval world, the political reality of a China that was not, at that moment, a Chinese dynasty at all. We're going to look at what was plausible, what was exaggerated, what was almost certainly borrowed, and what rings with the specific, unglamorous detail that only someone who is actually there tends to notice. This is not a takedown. It's not a rehabilitation either. It's a careful look at a man, a book, and a civilization, and the long, strange journey between all three. Before we go any further, quick question. Where are you right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely check them, and there is something quietly remarkable about a video like this, reaching someone in Osaka at 2 in the morning, and someone in São Paulo at their lunch break, and someone in Edinburgh on a Sunday evening all at the same time. The world Marco Polo was trying to describe across a single lifetime, you're crossing in a comment section. Tell me where you are. And if you want to listen to this without any ads and without any background music, the best way to support what I do here is to follow the channel on Spotify. It's ad-free, music-free, just the story. Link is in the description and it genuinely helps more than most things. Now, back to Marco Polo. We're going to move through this the way the story actually unfolded, starting in Venice, a city already tangled in the trade routes that made the Polo family possible, moving through what the Silk Roads actually were in the late 13th century, why they existed, who controlled them, and why a Venetian merchant travelling them wasn't quite as outlandish as it sounds. Then into China itself, not the China of the imagination, but the China of Kublai Khan, which was something stranger and more specific than either Marco Polo's readers or most modern audiences fully grasp. We'll end somewhere honest, not with a verdict, but with a probability. A plausible shape of what one man might have seen, remembered, described, had described to him, embellished, misunderstood, and handed to a ghostwriter in a Genoese prison where the whole thing was committed to parchment in a language that wasn't even his own. 700 years later, we're still arguing about it. That alone tells you something worth knowing, so settle in. The road to Kublai Khan's court is long, and it starts, as most things do, with someone who needed money. Venice in the late 13th century was not a place you stumbled into by accident. It was a place you built, deliberately, obsessively, out of water and ambition, and an almost pathological understanding of where value came from and how to move it. The city had no farmland worth speaking of, no forests, no mines. What it had was a position, sitting at the hinge between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Venice had turned geography into an empire of transactions. Spices from the Levant, silk from Persia, glass that Venetian craftsmen had learned to make so beautifully that other cities tried to steal the techniques, and Venice responded by essentially imprisoning the glassmakers on an island to keep the secrets contained. This was a society that understood at a cellular level that information about trade routes was worth more than almost anything the routes carried. The Crusades had complicated things. They had also accelerated things. European soldiers marching east, and mostly failing to hold what they seized, had nonetheless cracked open a world that Western Europe had only dimly understood through rumour and scripture. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 had ended with Crusaders sacking Constantinople, a Christian city, which tells you something about how far sacred purpose had drifted from commercial logic. Venice had largely bankrolled that particular disaster, and had come away from it with trading posts scattered across the eastern Mediterranean and a taste for what lay further beyond. When the crusading momentum finally exhausted itself, the appetite for Eastern goods did not. If anything, it intensified. The question was simply who would supply it. Into this world, the Polo family was not extraordinary. That's one of the most important and least appreciated things about them. Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, Marco's father and uncle, were Venetian merchants of middling significance who had already made one journey east before Marco joined them on the second. They had trading contacts in Constantinople and along the Black Sea. They dealt in jewels, probably, and whatever else the routes rewarded. The idea that a Venetian merchant family might push their network all the way to the Mongol court is surprising to modern ears trained on the idea of impassable distances. But to the Polos it would have felt more like following an opportunity to its logical conclusion. Trade networks are not walls, they are corridors, and corridors can be extended if the incentives are large enough and the conditions are right. The conditions in the 1260s and 1270s were unusually right. This is the piece that most popular accounts of Marco Polo underemphasize because it requires understanding something about the Mongols that cuts against their popular image as pure destroyers. Yes, Mongol expansion had been catastrophic in ways that are difficult to overstate. Cities had been levelled. Populations had been reduced to rubble and silence across Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. But in the aftermath of that expansion, something remarkable had happened. A vast corridor of relative stability had opened across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica, scholars call it, though the word peace carries significant irony given how it was achieved. Mongol control stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland and Hungary. Along that corridor, merchants, diplomats, missionaries and spies could move in ways that had been impossible when the same territory was fragmented among dozens of hostile powers. The roads were policed. There were relay stations where horses could be exchanged. There were legal protections, however imperfectly enforced, for travelling merchants operating under Mongol authorization. It was dangerous. It was grueling. People died on those roads from cold and thirst and bandits operating beyond Mongol reach. But it was doable, and the Polos, whatever else they were people who knew how to calculate when something difficult was worth attempting. Marco enters this world at roughly 17, depending on which account you trust, joining his father and uncle on what was already their second overland journey toward the court of Kublai Khan. Niccolo and Maffeo had met Kublai, or at least that's the story, and had brought back a request. The great Khan wanted 100 scholars and some oil from the lamp at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The scholars never materialized, the political situation in Europe being what it was. But the Polos went back with the oil and with the young Marco, whose presence on the journey may have been practical, may have been sentimental, may have been simply what happened when a merchant family's son came of age, in an era when the road was where your future was made or lost. What his eventual audience wanted from the account he brought back was a specific mixture of things. They wanted wonders, because medieval travel literature was a genre of the marvellous, a way of mapping the edges of the known world with creatures and customs strange enough to confirm that God's creation was larger than ordinary imagination could grasp. They wanted riches described in terms vivid enough to make the mouth water. And they wanted usable intelligence, practical knowledge of routes, commodities, rulers, protocols for interaction. The same text could function as entertainment for a nobleman and as a trade manual for a merchant. The best travel writing of the era was both simultaneously. Marco Polo's account, as it eventually came to be written, tries to serve all of those purposes at once, and that ambition is part of what makes it so difficult to read cleanly across 7 centuries. When he describes a city as having more wealth than could be conceived, he is partly using the conventional language of wonder that his genre demanded. When he describes the mechanics of paper currency in almost procedural detail, he is addressing a different reader entirely, one who needs to understand how money works in a place where money looks completely different from anything they have ever touched. The China he is walking toward, and which we're going to spend most of this story trying to see through his eyes, is not waiting for him neutrally. It is already being filtered before he arrives by what Venice needed, by what his family's commercial logic valued, by what the genre of his eventual book rewarded, and by what the Mongol rulers who would grant him access wanted to project about themselves. He is not a neutral observer entering a neutral scene. Nobody ever is. But in the late 13th century, the gap between the observer and the observed is particularly wide, and the translation chain between them is particularly long. That's the lens we need to carry with us. His China is a real place seen through real eyes that had been shaped, before they ever opened on a Mongol palace, by the specific hungers of a merchant city balanced on water at the edge of a world it was desperate to understand. When Marco Polo finally came back to Venice, assuming we accept that he did, the story did not immediately turn into a book. It turned into something more prosaic and more dangerous, a man again involved in the politics and warfare of an Italian trading city. Venice and Genoa were rivals locked into a long, grinding struggle over who would control the richest sea lanes. In 1298, Marco ended up on the losing side of one of their naval battles. He was captured and taken to Genoa as a prisoner of war. So the book that would define his reputation begins not with a triumphant return and a quiet desk, but with captivity. A Venetian merchant in a Genoese cell, middle-aged, probably nursing injuries, with time on his hands and a head full of stories. And it's in that setting that he meets a man named Rustichello of Pisa. Rustichello was not a merchant. He was a writer, in the particular sense that existed in late 13th century Italy, a professional compiler of romances. He had already produced Arthurian tales in French, full of knights and quests and episodes, carefully tuned to the tastes of noble audiences. He understood structure, pacing, and the delicate art of making something feel both credible enough to hold attention and marvellous enough to feel worth retelling. Put those two people in the same cell, and what you get is not Marco Polo's diary. You get a collaboration, one man supplying memories, impressions, and commercial intelligence, the other shaping all of that into a narrative that would satisfy the literary market he knew. The text itself tells us this. In some versions, it introduces itself as the Book of Messer Marco Polo, citizen of Venice, written and composed by Messer Rustichello of Pisa. That's not just a formality. It's a quiet admission that what we are holding is already at least second-hand. This matters because it forces us to think about how the content got from Marco's mind to the page. He was not writing in Latin in a scholar's script. He was apparently dictating in some kind of Venetian or Franco-Italian to a man whose working language for literature was a French-leaning vernacular. Then that man was framing the material using the narrative habits of chivalric romance, set pieces, repeated formulas, conventional openings to chapters, and an eye for the marvel. Memory is not a neutral tape recorder, even in the best of circumstances. Now add years of time since the events in China, the urge to impress fellow prisoners and potential patrons with how far you've gone and whom you've met, and a co-author trained to amplify what will play well in courts and city palaces. Details that would have been boring but accurate might be compressed. Things that were striking might be polished to a finer shine. The outline of a real experience can be faithfully kept, while the edges are blurred and smoothed to fit a genre. Then, even if that moment of dictation in a Genoese prison had produced a single fixed text, we would still not possess it. What we actually have 6 centuries later is something scholars sometimes call a textual cloud. Dozens of manuscripts, in multiple languages, Old French, Franco-Italian, Tuscan, Latin, none of them obviously the single original, all of them disagreeing with each other in ways that range from trivial to significant. Copyists did what copyists always do. They misread, they corrected, they harmonized, they updated spellings, they inserted glosses that later became part of the main text. A scribe unfamiliar with an exotic place name might substitute a more familiar one. A number that looked implausible might be fixed, either enlarged to increase wonder or reduced to bring it back within the limits of the believable. The further the manuscript travelled from whatever Rustichello first wrote down, the more it picked up the fingerprints of the people who handled it. The title alone is a lesson in how much this matters. The work is known in Latin as the Devisement du Monde, description of the world, or in later tradition as Il Milione, the million. One explanation for that last title is that it referred to the family nickname the Polos supposedly acquired, as if to say those million storytellers because of Marco's tendency to speak in vast numbers. Another possibility is that it emphasized the book's insistence on scale, on numbers that strained credulity, 1 million households, armies beyond counting, revenues that sounded like jokes to a European reader. But depending on which manuscript you pick up, what the book calls itself, and thus what it announces itself as trying to be, shifts subtly. Even inside the chapters, small adjustments have large consequences. A city name altered by a single syllable may move an episode hundreds of miles east or west when modern historians try to match it to known places. A phrase that in one version calls Kublai Khan Lord of all the Tartars of the world might in another simply call him the greatest king, softening the political statement and emphasizing the romance tone instead. Numbers fare worst. Medieval numerals are easy to miscopy. Zeros multiply or vanish, tens become hundreds, hundreds become thousands. When Marco or Rustichello says that a city has 12,000 bridges, we are already in the realm of hyperbole. When one manuscript quietly upgrades that to 12 times 12,000, we drift further away from geography and deeper into the language of wonder. Beneath all these variations lies a more basic question. What kind of book did Rustichello believe he was making? To a modern reader, especially one hunting for historical data, it can look like a travel report with some colourful flourishes. To a 13th century audience raised on chansons de geste and Arthurian cycles, It probably felt more like an astonishing new branch on a familiar tree. Here, instead of Britain or Brittany, the stage is Cathay and Mangi. Instead of knights errant, we have envoys and merchants. But the beats are recognizable, powerful rulers testing the virtues of those who approach them, strange customs that reveal moral lessons, journeys that signal inner as well as outer transformation. This mixture means that what looks like sober reportage can be, at the same time, fulfilling the requirements of romance. A long, careful description of paper money does practical work for merchants who might someday need to transact in that medium. It also lets Rustichello craft a scene in which a mighty ruler seems almost godlike, able to make value appear from mulberry bark. An account of a city's canals and warehouses can function both as a logistical note and as a set piece of marvel, a place where so much grain moves that the imagination itself seems to overflow. In the same way, what appears to us as embellishment may have been, for its first readers, simply the proper flavour of the dish. Leaving wonder out would have been as strange as leaving salt out of bread. Rustichello could not sell a purely dry gazetteer of Eastern courts. Marco, if he wanted his experiences to travel beyond his cell, could not insist on one. So when we ask what Marco Polo really wrote, we are already asking the wrong kind of question. There was almost certainly no single definitive version that then degenerated into corrupt copies. There was a dictated core, shaped in real time by a romance writer, immediately passed into a scribal ecosystem where every act of copying was also an act of interpretation. The text is layered. At the deepest level are the things Marco claims to have seen or heard in Mongol domains. Above that sits the narrative architecture that Rustichello knew how to build. Above that, the centuries of copying, translating, and correcting that adapt the book to new readers, new tastes, and new expectations. For our purposes, the most useful rule is to treat the work not as a photograph, but as a palimpsest. When we read a passage, we are not listening solely to Marco's voice. We are hearing Marco as filtered through Rustichello's literary instincts, and then through the pens of dozens of anonymous hands. Some layers we can peel back with careful comparison of manuscripts, and with what we know from Chinese and Persian sources. Others remain stubbornly fused. This does not mean the book is useless as evidence. It means that every sentence has to be held up to the light at an angle to see which parts are more likely to be memory, which parts are genre convention, which parts are later noise. Once we accept that, the text becomes less a problem and more a landscape. Not a single road we can march down, but a network of paths we can trace, always asking, whose step are we following here? Marco's, Rustichello's, or some forgotten copyist who believed in good faith that he was repairing the story. With that map in mind, we can now turn to the question that hovers over the entire tradition. Given this layered, shifting book, how far can we trust it when it claims that a young Venetian actually stood in the service of the great Khan in China? If you start from the end of the story and work backwards, the easiest position to take is the skeptical one. You look at this elaborate, shape-shifting manuscript cloud, and you say, perhaps the simplest explanation is that Marco never went to China at all. The arguments come quickly. If he really served Kublai Khan for years, why do Chinese sources from the Yuan dynasty not mention him by name? These are archives famous for their bureaucratic thoroughness. Officials catalogued grain shipments, horse fodder, and the comings and goings of minor envoys. Surely a foreigner from a distant land serving at court would leave some trace. Then there are the silences inside the book itself. No mention of the Great Wall as we picture it, marching along the northern frontier. Nothing about tea as a daily drink or footbinding among elite women in the south. Practices that loom large in our modern imagination of China seem simply not to exist in his pages. The mind reaches for an explanation. The author was working at a distance, cobbling things together from what he heard in Black Sea ports or in the bazaars of Tabriz. He was repeating second-hand tales, and so the texture is wrong. Important things are missing, odd things are emphasized. Skeptics also point to details that seem skewed or simply bizarre. Numbers that inflate cities into impossible giants. Claims about armies whose size would have stripped whole provinces bare of food. Stories of strange customs that, when checked against other sources, fit better in Persia or India than in northern China, but appear in his text as if they belonged to Cathay. From this angle, the book looks like what you would expect from a clever, well-travelled Venetian who went far enough east to impress his neighbours, then let his story expand with each retelling until even he was not sure where memory ended and embroidery began. It is a tidy picture, but it leaves things out, because if you walk around to the other side and listen to the defenders, a different outline comes into focus. They begin with the things the book gets right, in ways that are hard to fake from a distance. Marco describes paper money, not just the fact of it, but its raw materials, its serial stamps, the official seals, the penalties for counterfeiting, the way it circulates alongside bolts of silk and ingots of precious metal. He notes the use of coal, black stones that burn in northern China, at a time when most Europeans had little experience of anything but wood and charcoal. He understands the seasonal rhythms of the Yuan postal relay system, the approximate distances between stations, the kinds of horses reserved for imperial envoys. More than any single marvel, it is the cumulative coherence that impresses. The routes he claims to have taken through Persia, Central Asia, and into Mongol-ruled China line up, in broad strokes, with the main arteries of overland travel in the late 13th century. His sequence of cities in certain stretches matches what we know from Muslim geographers. He gets right which ports in southern China are major and which are secondary. He distinguishes between different kinds of salt production and different tax regimes applied to them. These are the kinds of details a merchant notices, because they bear directly on risk and profit. They are also the kinds of details that are difficult to assemble purely from tavern gossip in the Mediterranean. Defenders point out something else. The world Marco describes is not a fantasized kingdom in the clouds. It is a recognizably Mongol world. The social logic is that of the Pax Mongolica, a ruler who draws in foreigners of many faiths and languages, who uses them as specialists, as intermediaries, as tethered guests. We know from Persian and Chinese sources that the Yuan court contained Uyghur scribes, Muslim administrators, Nestorian Christian advisors, and artisans taken from the Middle East. That a Venetian family might find a niche in this mixed environment is not far-fetched. It's almost expected. If such people existed, why are they invisible in the Chinese record? Here the debate leaves the shores of certainty and sails into probability. Yuan bureaucratic documents are extensive, but they are not a census of every outsider who passed through. Foreigners attached to Mongol households or employed in ad hoc capacities might appear, if at all, under names that look nothing like the ones we use for them. A Venetian Marco in a Persian-speaking milieu might be known by a Persianized form of his name. A Chinese clerk hearing that name might render it into characters that approximate the sounds. Later historians reading those characters might file him mentally as just another Central Asian assistant in a long list. Names across languages do not travel intact, they mutate. Johannes becomes John, becomes Giovanni, becomes Juan. In Mongol and Persian and Chinese documents, we see the same sliding. A single historical figure can bear 3 or 4 shapes at once, depending on who is doing the writing. So when modern scholars say, we find no Marco Polo in Yuan records, they are already looking through a filter. They are looking for a Latin name or an obvious echo of it. But if the man was known under a Turkic nickname, or a Chinese transcription that nobody has thought to associate with him, he could be present in the sources and still effectively invisible to us. Even titles and roles are slippery. What the book calls service to the great Khan might not correspond neatly to a formal office in a bureaucratic list. Being employed on occasional missions or attached to a patron who had direct access to the court would feel to a Venetian telling his story later like service to Kublai, even if he never appears in ledgers of salaried officials. The Mongol system blurred personal, tribal, and institutional relationships in ways that fit poorly with our tidy categories. Once you admit these layers of translation and categorization, the sharp contrast between named in the Chinese sources and not there at all becomes less decisive. Absence of obvious evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, especially when you're searching across alphabets, languages, and archival survival. Still, even many defenders hesitate to claim that every page of the book reflects direct experience. They entertain middle possibilities. One version has Marco going all the way to China with his father and uncle, spending time there, but then filling in gaps in his memory later with what other merchants told him in Persia or on the return voyage. Another suggests that the Polos themselves may have gone only as far as the western edges of the Yuan realm, places where Persian influence was stronger, where information about the deeper interior still circulated, but not always cleanly. In that scenario, a stretch of first-hand observation from, say, Kublai's northern capital might sit right next to a chapter composed almost entirely from hearsay about southern provinces. There is also the blending effect of collaboration. Rusticello, primed to think in terms of episodes and wonders, could easily have slotted in set pieces from the general repertoire of Eastern marvels. A story heard in an Italian court about somewhere vaguely in the lands of the great Khan could be attached to a place name Marco mentioned, with both men sincerely believing that it belonged there. The resulting text would be neither deliberate fraud nor pure reportage. It would be a mosaic, the stones of experience and the stones of tradition arranged into an appealing pattern. If you try to force a verdict, did he go or didn't he, you end up simplifying that mosaic into something flatter than it deserves to be. The more productive stance is to keep the question open and treat the book as an artifact that tells us things regardless of where its author's feet actually stood on any given day. One layer of revelation is about Europe itself. The kinds of things the book chooses to describe at length, paper money, salt revenues, city warehouses, show what would have struck a late 13th century Venetian as astonishing. They show what counted as worth telling to his imagined audience. Another layer is about the Mongol world, even filtered, even embroidered, the portrait of a transcontinental empire that links China, Central Asia, and the Middle East matches what we see from other directions. The specific measurements of a canal may wobble, but the existence of a canal-laced grain system in the lower Yangtze stands firm. Perhaps the most useful way to hold the problem, especially if you're listening to this in the half-light between waking and sleep, is to imagine the book as a voice at a crossroads. Information is flowing from east to west, through merchants, envoys, hostages, missionaries. Some of it comes from eyes that saw, some from mouths that heard, some from texts translated and retranslated. Marco's narrative is one place where those streams converge and are given a single name. Whether that name belongs to a man who knelt often before Kublai Khan, or to a man who reached only the empire's thresholds and then listened very carefully, or to a man who did both and then let his memories blend with other people's tales. The text he helped produce remains a key to how late medieval Europe imagined China. In the next part, we will lean into that imagination. We'll look at how the Mongol Empire itself shaped what could be seen, who could travel, and how a young Venetian, even an imperfectly remembered one, might have found himself moving inside an empire that treated China not as a self-contained kingdom, but as one province of a much larger, restless world. To understand the China that appears in Marco's pages, it helps to set aside, for a moment, the word China itself. The people Marco met did not live in a country called China, ruled by a Chinese dynasty in the way later Ming and Qing subjects would. They lived in a section of a vast, stitched-together dominion ruled by Kublai Khan and his relatives. On the maps of the time, if you could have unrolled one in Kublai's throne room, you would not see a neat block labelled China. You would see lands of many names, many scripts, many tax systems, all nested inside something larger, the empire of the Mongols. Kublai's Yuan dynasty, as later historians call it, was only one branch of that family tree. His cousins held power in Persia as the Ilkhans. Other lines ruled on the steppe north of the Black Sea and over the forests and rivers of what we now call Russia. Their horsemen and their envoys moved across a continent on intersecting routes that tied together the wheat fields near Baghdad, the fur trappers in Siberia, the oases of Central Asia, and the rice paddies of the Yangtze Delta. From inside that system, what we would label China was not an isolated civilization at the edge of the known world. It was a rich, heavily populated, agriculturally sophisticated region of an empire that thought of itself as boundless. The ruling class reflected that Kublai himself was a Mongol. But the people who helped him govern were drawn from everywhere his banners had reached. Uyghur scribes, experienced with multiple scripts, handled documents in Turkic and Mongolian, and translated between cultures. Persian and Central Asian Muslims collected taxes and managed some of the most lucrative monopolies, especially in the north and northwest. Tibetan lamas advised on ritual and legitimacy. Nestorian Christians hovered at court, sometimes as envoys, sometimes as interpreters, sometimes simply as curious guests. Chinese officials were there too, of course. Administrators from North China, who had already served under the Jin dynasty, scholars and clerks from the southern Song who were gradually pulled into Mongol service after conquest. But they were not alone, and they were not always at the top of the hierarchy. From Kublai's perspective, a mixture of peoples in key offices was a feature, not a bug. It reduced the chance that any one group could monopolize power against him. If you imagine standing in one of his audience halls, you might hear half a dozen languages in the space of a few minutes. Orders issued in Mongolian, glossed into Chinese for local officials, summarized in Persian for tax farmers, carried away on paper written in scripts that had never existed in Europe. It is inside this multilingual, multi-ethnic space that a Venetian merchant family begins to make sense. In a world like this, being from far away is not necessarily a handicap. It can be a credential. The Mongol rulers had a habit of using outsiders in roles where they wanted loyal, dependent specialists. A foreigner has fewer local ties. He is less enmeshed in the clan politics of the region he is sent to oversee. He owes his position, very visibly, to the favour of the Khan. That makes him useful. We can see this pattern clearly in places where the records are fuller. In Persia, Armenian and Georgian Christians, as well as Muslims from distant cities, appeared as fiscal agents and translators. In Central Asia, Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples served as the connective tissue between Chinese-speaking farmers, Mongol princes, and Persian-speaking traders. We know from Chinese and Persian sources that engineers from the Middle East were relocated to East Asia to help with siegecraft, bridge building, and irrigation. Craftsmen from conquered cities were pulled up and resettled thousands of kilometers away, redirected like living cargo to where the empire needed their skills. Once you accept that this was standard practice, a foreigner from Venice does not feel out of place. He feels like one more thread in a wide, deliberate weave. This helps explain the particular flavour of Marco's narrative. When you read his account of Yuan rule, you do not often get intimate portraits of potters in village kilns, or the private rituals of families in Hangzhou courtyards. You get systems. He tells you how the postal relays are organised, How many horses are theoretically kept in reserve? How far apart the stations lie in days of travel? He outlines the structure of provincial administration, lists the names of major cities in a hierarchical way, and notes which regions send grain, which send silk, which send salt revenue. He describes the issuing of paper money as a process, with raw materials and stamping and enforcement. He lingers over the mechanism of state-run granaries and the way famine relief is supposed to work. This is not how a village guest sees a country, it is how someone at the edges of empire sees a machine. Living near the Mongol court, or even just circulating in the orbit of its officials, would naturally draw a person's attention to flows of power, tax, logistics, appointments, monopolies. These were the things that preoccupied the men above him. These were the things that determined profits, risks, and the fate of caravans. And so, even if Marco never held high office, his vantage point would be imperial, not local. The Pax Mongolica is the name modern historians sometimes give to the relative stability that this machine briefly imposed on Asia and parts of Europe. Under its shelter, caravans could move from the Black Sea to the Yellow River with fewer interruptions from banditry or petty border wars than had been common in earlier centuries. Mongol envoys carried official passports that commanded assistance from governors thousands of kilometers apart. Merchants benefited from standardized tariffs, familiar procedures, and a shared expectation that the Khan's messengers, at least, were not to be harmed. Marco's routes, as he describes them, trace these arteries. He moves from the eastern Mediterranean into the lands of the Ilkhans, across Central Asia, through way stations that appear in other travellers' reports, and then into what he calls Cathay and Mangi, north and south under Mongol rule. To him, Persia and China are not sealed worlds. They are districts in one empire whose roads, postal stations, and fiscal systems interlock. When he notes something in China, he often immediately compares it, implicitly or explicitly, to other parts of this Mongol world. The salt revenues of one province are matched against those of a region in Persia. The paper money in Kublai's domains is contrasted with the metal coinage farther west. The size and splendour of a Chinese city are measured along the same mental axis as the cities of the Middle East. It is as if he is walking the corridors of one enormous palace, moving from wing to wing. Inside that corridor, foreigners like him are not rare anomalies. They are baked into the design. The Mongols made a habit of drawing in specialists from the lands they had conquered or frightened into submission. Astronomers from Persia worked on calendars at Chinese observatories. Doctors from Central Asia practiced at courts far from home. Buddhist monks, Muslim jurists, and Christian clerics all jockeyed for favour in the same imperial spaces. For an ambitious Venetian, this created a paradoxical kind of opportunity. In Europe, he would be one merchant among many, competing in a crowded field along familiar routes. In the Mongol Empire, his difference could be an asset. His knowledge of Mediterranean trade, his contacts in Black Sea ports, even his ability to move in Latin and in the commercial dialects of the Levant, could be turned to use by rulers who were always looking for new channels of information and profit. In that light, the picture of Marco as some sort of ad hoc envoy, dispatched on missions that do not show up in the surviving Chinese lists of official posts, becomes less fanciful. It fits a pattern. It is the sort of thing the Mongols did over and over, with people from dozens of backgrounds whose names have blurred or vanished in the record. And here the Pax Mongolica lens begins to explain both what his book illuminates and what it leaves in shadow. Because he was, or at least presents himself as, situated within an imperial network, he sees and describes those parts of China that interface most directly with that network: the tax farms, the ports, the canals that move grain for the state, the relay stations that carry orders. He is attentive to categories that matter at the level of the Khan's accountants. Which region produces what? which cities guard key crossings, where revenue streams are thickest. What he does not linger on are the internal cultural textures that might loom large for someone who identified first and foremost as a subject of a Chinese dynasty. The small rituals around tea, the aesthetics of private gardens, the deep, subtle gradations of status encoded in examination degrees and classical learning. For many Mongol and foreign administrators, these things were background. The crucial questions were more blunt. Does this district pay? Can it be moved? Is it loyal? This asymmetry does not prove where Marco stood on any given day, but it does point to the kind of eyes through which China is being observed in his narrative. The eyes of someone standing inside an empire that happens at that moment to include China, rather than the eyes of someone who treats China as a self-enclosed world. As we move deeper into the story, this will matter. It will help us make sense of why he is sometimes startlingly precise when he talks about money, salt, transport and administration, and strangely quiet or oddly general when it comes to everyday customs, inner walls and domestic life. In the next section, we'll bring that same lens to Kublai Khan's court itself. We'll look at the world Marco claims to have entered, a court of spectacle and ceremony, yes, but also a workplace where service could mean anything from delivering a message to governing a province, and where a young foreigner might find himself both awed and deeply, practically engaged in the machinery of Mongol rule. If you follow Marco's story as he tells it, there's a pivot. For a while you are travelling with him, across deserts, through cities, along caravan tracks. Then, suddenly, you are not on the road anymore, you are at court. Kublai's court, as Marco presents it, is not just a palace where a ruler happens to live. It is a stage on which the right to rule is constantly being acted out. The spectacles he describes have a rhythm to them. Seasonal ceremonies tied to the lunar calendar. Great hunts that look in his telling like moving fortresses of horsemen, beaters, falconers and dog handlers, all orchestrated to drive game toward the Khan. Feasts where thousands are said to dine with precise arrangements of tables, colours and costumes that map out hierarchy in physical space. Modern readers sometimes smile at his numbers. 100,000 this, 10,000 that. They are almost certainly inflated, but if you strip away the arithmetic and look at the structure, the pattern is familiar from other sources. Mongol rulers did use grand hunts as political theatre, showing off their control of land, animals and armed men in one continuous performance. They did hold vast feasts timed to New Year, to military victories, to significant omens. They did sit at the centre of ceremonies in which the distances between people, the steps you could take toward the throne, the angle at which you bowed, the order in which you were served were themselves part of the message. To a visitor from Venice, raised in the world of Italian city-states and Latin Christendom, this kind of staging could feel overwhelming. It is easy to imagine being impressed not only by the scale, but by the choreography. Paper passes, seals, scribes, guards with fixed roles, musicians who begin and end at signals, cups that must be lifted and lowered at the right moment. A foreigner watching all this might well think, this is not just power. This is power proving itself. Marco's descriptions lean into that feeling. He repeats in different places that Kublai holds court in great halls whose pillars are gilded and painted with dragons, that he wears furs and brocades suited to the season, that he moves between palaces depending on the time of year. He notes the hunting preserves, the portable palaces, the elaborate tents. He talks about the white mares whose milk is reserved for the Khan and his special rituals, and the way noble families send their sons and daughters into the courtly orbit. All of this, if you read it as simple luxury, can feel like a medieval travel writer exaggerating to keep his audience awake. But inside the logic of Mongol rule, it is functional. The hunts double as military musters and training exercises. The seasonal moves echo the steppe tradition of rotating pastures. The feasts knit together a multi-ethnic elite with shared food, oaths and gifts. The rituals around horses and fermented mare's milk tie Kublai, the urban ruler of China, back to the older, wilder prestige of the steppe. In that setting, what does it mean when Marco says he served the great Khan? The book, as it has come down to us, piles up titles. Sometimes he is called a baron. Sometimes he is described as a messenger or ambassador sent to distant courts. In some manuscripts, later readers and copyists have clearly been tempted to nudge his status upward, turning a practical assignment into an official office, a favour into a rank. Part of this inflation is probably literary. Medieval audiences like to hear about knights and barons, not about mid-level fixers whose job was to carry instructions from one bureaucrat to another. Part of it is linguistic. The original work, dictated in a Franco-Italian mix, and then copied and translated into Latin and other vernaculars, passed through hands that had to map Mongol and Persian concepts onto European words. A person entrusted with a specific task by the Khan could easily be described with a term that, in Europe, implied hereditary nobility. If we peel that back and combine his narrative with what is known from Mongol administrative practice, a more modest but plausible picture appears. Serving the Khan could mean being attached to his court in some semi-official capacity without holding a formal Chinese or Mongol rank. It could involve messenger work, carrying letters, verbal reports and gifts between Kublai's court and local governors, Mongol princes, foreign rulers, or commercial partners. The empire depended on constant communication. Trusted envoys who could move along protected routes and report back were a valuable asset. Service could also mean being used for ad hoc administrative errands. Someone familiar with trade in the Eastern Mediterranean might be sent to inspect a port, check on customs collections, or evaluate a proposal involving foreign merchants. Someone with a knack for languages might interpret between a Persian tax farmer and a Chinese clerk, or accompany an embassy where both sides lacked a shared tongue. There were trade missions too, which blur into diplomacy. When Marco talks about being sent to places on Kublai's behalf, it is easy to imagine assignments that combined commercial and political aims. Carry this letter. Observe what you can about that ruler's attitude, bring back useful information, and, while you're there, see what goods move through that harbour and how their tariffs are structured. None of these roles would necessarily produce entries in the surviving Chinese lists of officials. They would look, from the core bureaucracy's perspective, like temporary uses of foreign specialists, recorded in internal memoranda that have long since vanished. But from the viewpoint of an individual like Marco, they would feel like serious, even exalted responsibilities, being summoned, being trusted, being given orders in the name of the great Khan. One place where his narrative lines up well with what we know is in the dry details that most storytellers would skip. He is remarkably attentive to distances, how many days' journey lie between key points, how fast an official messenger can travel on relay horses, which routes are safe and which are dangerous. He notes ranks in a way that reflects Mongol practice. The 1,000 households, the tens of thousands, the groupings of troops and households under specific commanders. He tracks flows of tribute, who sends what, in which season, from which region to Kublai's court. He also describes logistics with an almost accountant's eye. How grain is moved along canals toward the capital. How paper money is issued and enforced. How hunting parks are stocked and protected. These are the sorts of things that people close to power worry about. They are also the sorts of things a merchant family, always alert to bottlenecks and opportunities, would naturally notice. When he praises Kublai, which he does frequently, it is in terms that align with these systems. The Khan is generous, he says, because he distributes gifts and maintains granaries. He is just because he enforces postal protections and punishes bandits. He is wise because he selects talented men from many peoples to serve him and keeps roads open and trade flowing. This pattern matters. In a world where patronage decides your future, speaking well of your patron or the patron you hope still remembers you is not just politeness. It is strategy. Praise can be an attempt to keep a door open across time and distance. It can also be a way of signalling to future listeners, some of whom might themselves be rulers or nobles, that you know how to talk about power in the right key. So when Marco exalts Kublai, we can read it on several levels at once, as genuine awe in the face of a kind of imperial splendour Europe had rarely seen, as a literary device meant to hold the attention of war-weary cellmates, and later aristocratic readers, and as a patterned response from someone who understood that patronage is fragile and that reputations can travel faster than caravans. Under all these layers, though, the court he describes does not feel like pure invention. The mechanisms he outlines, the hierarchies he sketches, the ceremonial frames he evokes, all dovetail with independent evidence from Persian, Chinese, and Arabic sources. Titles may be slippery, numbers may be swollen, his own place in the machine may be presented with the generous lighting, a narrator gives himself. But the machine itself, the style of court, the methods of rule, the use of foreigners in flexible, semi-formal roles, rings true. This leaves us in an in-between place. We probably cannot know, in a precise, modern, bureaucratic sense, what Marco's job description was at Kublai's court. We can suspect that it shifted over time, that it mixed private commercial interests with service to the throne, that it looked different on paper in different languages. What we can say is that the setting he claims to have moved through is historically coherent. The kind of work he hints at is the kind of work the Mongols were in the habit of assigning. As we turn away from the throne room and step back into the empire outside, we can carry that with us. When he talks about cities, incomes, and astonishing numbers in the next part of the story, he is not simply counting buildings. He is, in some sense, still serving the Khan, measuring the world as it appears from a court where spectacle and logistics are two sides of the same power. When Marco steps out of the palace and starts talking about cities, something similar happens to what we saw at court. The numbers swell. He writes about cities with 100,000 bridges, provinces yielding revenues that sound like half the world's wealth, streets so crowded with merchants that you can barely walk. For a modern reader, especially one half-dozing with the book on a nightstand, this can feel like a signal to stop taking him seriously. Surely no city on earth had 100,000 bridges. But here too, the way medieval texts work matters. In Latin Christendom, big numbers were not precision instruments. They were loudspeakers, copyists often rounded, miscopied, or improved figures. Terms like 10,000 or 100,000 slid easily from meaning this exact quantity to meaning so many. You can't count them. When Marco says a thing happens infinite times, nobody thinks he has actually performed the calculation. On top of that, the book we call Marco Polo is not a stable single text. It exists in multiple manuscript families with different figures in different versions. A scribe in Venice copies a 10,000. A scribe in Paris turns it into 60,000. Another, generations later, adds a 0 in the margin or misreads a smudged numeral. You end up with a city that has more households than the whole region plausibly contained. There is also rhetoric. Medieval writers like to convey vastness through formulas. So many bridges that no man could count them. More merchants than in any other city. A revenue beyond measure. In speech, these phrases carry tone. On the page they become numbers, So one gentle way to read Marco's arithmetic is to take a step back from the digits and ask, what is the direction of the exaggeration? Is he trying to tell us not that Hangzhou had exactly X bridges, but that its built environment was so interlaced with water that bridges defined everyday life? Not that a province yielded exactly wee bezants, but that its fiscal weight was large enough to matter to an empire that thought in empire-scale sums? When historians compare his claims to what we have from archaeology and Chinese records, the answer that emerges is often yes, the scale really was extraordinary, even if his specific numbers are off. Under the Southern Song, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, China experienced a level of urbanization that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Cities like Linan, the Song capital on the site of today's Hangzhou, were already enormous before the Mongols arrived. Contemporary Chinese texts speak of more than 1 million people in and around the city, of densely packed wards, crowded markets and suburbs blending into surrounding countryside. They describe long causeways, clusters of bridges, rows of shops along canals. When the Mongols conquered and folded this landscape into their own empire, they did not erase those structures. They repurposed them. Kublai's Yuan government moved its capital north to what became Dadu, near modern Beijing, but cities like Hangzhou remained wealthy regional hubs. Grain still moved along canals, textiles, ceramics and salt still fed tax registers. Modern excavations and urban surveys back this up. The remains of city walls, canal beds, foundations and dumps of broken pottery showed dense occupation. Written sources from within China, tax registers, gazetteers, administrative memorials, list markets, craft quarters, and official warehouses. None of this gives us a simple, exact population number, but together they make it very hard to imagine these places as modest towns. They were, in the context of their time, megacities. So when Marco says that in one of these cities there are 12,000 bridges, it is almost certainly numerically wrong. But we also know that Hangzhou sat at the convergence of rivers, lakes, and artificial waterways, and that its urban fabric was famously laced with canals. Later, Chinese writers used the same motif. Countless bridges, arched and flat, thick with traffic. Painters dwell on them. Poets mention them as shorthand for the city's character. The detail that survives checking is not the integer. It is the theme. This is a city built on water, knit together by so many spans that crossing from one neighbourhood to another is an endless sequence of stepping up and over. Marco's attention in these passages is telling. He does not simply say, the city is big, and move on. He lingers on markets that operate day and night. He notices streets allocated to particular trades. Butchers here, spice sellers there, silk merchants along another stretch. He points out canals filled with barges carrying grain, salt and other goods, warehouses maintained by the state, relay stations along water routes as well as roads. Elsewhere, he talks about the grain that comes by water to the northern capital, the granaries that feed troops and officials, the customs offices that take their portion as goods pass through. He notes, again and again, the presence of bridges and causeways not just as scenery, but as infrastructure that shapes how people and products move. That pattern matches what we know independently about the Song and Yuan economic world. This was a civilization that had long since mastered large-scale canal building. The Grand Canal linking north and south was already an old artery before the Mongols took it over. Local networks, branch canals, feeder ditches, moats repurposed for traffic webbed out across the landscape. Urban prosperity depended on the smooth functioning of these watery roads. In Marco's telling, cities become nodes where all of this converges. Hangzhou is the clearest example, but not the only one. He praises a sequence of great cities across Cathay and Mangi, remarking on their wide streets. Their many bridges, their markets rich in food, textiles, and luxury goods. He does not always distinguish cleanly between what had been Song and what was now firmly Mongol, but he consistently treats the densely settled canal-fed south as a heartland of wealth. In doing so, he is also plugging into a wider tradition of travel writing. Long before Marco, Muslim geographers and merchants had written about Chinese port cities and inland capitals as places of astonishing abundance. They too used formulas: the greatest city in the world, more ships than in any other harbour, markets without equal. Later, after Marco, writers would repeat and amplify this image of Hangzhou and its peers as quasi-mythical centres of prosperity. In that literature, certain cities become symbols. Hangzhou, Quinsai, in many Western versions of Marco's text, stands for the riches of the south, just as Baghdad might stand for learning or Alexandria for trade. Calling it the noblest city in the world is less a careful ranking than a way of inscribing it into a geography of marvels. If you want to read Marco without getting tangled in the math, one gentle method is to treat his numbers as signals rather than measurements. When he gives a huge figure, ask, is he flagging this place as administratively important, as fiscally heavy, as unusually dense, as a major node in networks of trade and transport? Then set the specific number aside for a moment and see what other evidence exists. Does Chinese administrative material suggest that this prefecture was indeed a major tax base? Do excavation layers show intense, continuous occupation? Do other travellers mention similar features, markets, canals, shipyards, storage depots? If the answer is yes, then the core of his claim holds even if his 100,000 should really be 10,000, or several thousands, or simply a great many. Read this way, Marco's cityscapes stop looking like wild fantasies and start looking like slightly blurred photographs. The outlines are right, an empire with an unusually high share of its population living in towns, with state-directed logistics binding distant regions, with merchant activity on a scale that impressed someone raised among the comparatively smaller cities of the Mediterranean. He may dramatize, copyists may have inflated his already generous figures, but under the rounding, misread numerals and rhetorical flourishes, there is a consistent message. In Kublai's China, size matters, of cities, of markets, of storage systems that can feed a capital and supply armies. The bigness he is trying to get across is not just physical, it is systemic. And that, in turn, sets the stage for another number that sounded like magic to his European listeners, and still strikes modern readers as almost unbelievable. The idea that a government could make its own money out of paper, and that people in those vast, crowded cities would accept it as readily as silver or gold. When Marco turns from bridges and canals to money, the tone in the text shifts. You can almost feel him leaning forward, making sure his audience is still awake. He has described big cities. He has talked about caravans and ships. But now he brings out something that for a late 13th century European would have sounded like an outright marvel. A government that literally manufactures money out of plant fibres, stamps it with seals and compels everyone, from street vendors to foreign merchants, to accept it as if it were gold. In most versions of his book, this passage about paper currency is one of the most detailed and vivid sections. He spends pages on it. He goes step by step. He compares it explicitly to alchemy, turning something worthless into something precious. He describes mulberry bark being stripped from trees, pulped, pressed into sheets, cut into standardized sizes. He notes that each piece is impressed with official seals, signed or marked by authorized officials and backed by the authority of the Great Khan. He mentions denominations, larger and smaller, and how old or damaged notes can be brought back to the treasury and exchanged. What he identifies in his own language is a state monopoly. In Yuan-era China, The production of the main forms of paper money was not some private operation or a scattered local practice. It was centralized. Certain offices produced the notes. Certain officials oversaw their issuance. The empire tried, imperfectly but quite consciously, to control the supply. Marco emphasizes that the great Khan's sign gives the notes their power. He says that with these pieces of paper, Kublai can pay for all things. He talks about taxes, salaries, purchases for the palace itself, all being settled in these notes. He even claims that merchants from abroad, arriving with gold, silver, gems and other valuables, are required to sell their treasures to the court and receive paper in return. There is probably rhetorical heightening here. It is unlikely that every single foreign merchant was forced to convert all of their wealth into notes. But the underlying mechanism that the state channels precious metals into its own vaults and sends paper back into circulation is recognizably close to how Yuan fiscal policy often worked. The seal matters, the central treasury matters, the command that all shall accept this matters most of all. In Marco's account, refusal is not really an option. He remarks on penalties for those who decline the notes, penalties severe enough that nobody dares resist. Other sources from the period, Chinese and Persian, also point to harsh measures against counterfeiters and those who disrupted the paper money system. False notes could mean death. Tampering with seals was treason. Here, paper money is not a gentle experiment. It is a tool of imperial power. For someone from Venice or Genoa or the wider Latin West, this is a conceptual earthquake. In his world, money is, above all, metal. People pay with silver deniers and gros tournois, with gold florins and ducats, with copper coins for everyday markets. Even when credit instruments and bills of exchange start to appear among merchants, these float on the expectation that somewhere, at some point, there is metal backing them up. Everyone can feel the weight of money. You can bite it, weigh it, test it with your hands. If you mistrust a coin, you might scrape it, look for signs of debasement, test its ring on stone. The value is supposed to be in the substance itself, even if governments play tricks with the ratio of precious metal to base. The idea that a piece of paper with no intrinsic worth can circulate as money because a ruler declares it so, that is a much bigger psychological leap than it might feel to us, who live in a world of printed bills and digital balances. Marco does not have modern economic vocabulary, but he senses the leap. His narrative lingers on the paradox that the great Khan causes all his payments to be made with these notes, that everyone obeys, that immense trade continues. He is saying, in effect, the magic works. He also notices something deeper. The paper is not just a handy convenience. It is a visible sign of how centralized and organized this empire is. To issue paper money on a wide scale, you need more than bark and ink. You need a bureaucracy that can register, print, distribute, and monitor. You need officials who can keep accounts in terms of abstract units rather than sacks of coins. You need courts willing to enforce contracts denominated in this floating value. You need tax collectors who accept it, clerks who record it, merchants who price their goods in it. When Marco dwells on the power of the paper money, he is really pointing to the power of the system behind it. The great Khan, in his telling, sits at the centre of a web of officials, treasuries and registers. From that centre, he can project purchasing power across an empire without carting large quantities of metal around. He can pay soldiers on distant frontiers in notes. He can buy grain, horses, silk and spices with slips that cost almost nothing to manufacture, but carry all the weight of imperial authority. Modern historians see Yuan paper money as one stage in a longer Chinese story. Earlier dynasties, especially the Song, had already experimented with various forms of promissory notes, merchant-issued certificates, and government-authorized paper. By the time Kublai extended his rule over China, the notion that paper could function as a claim on value was not entirely new to Chinese society. But there was a difference of ambition and scale. The Mongol Yuan regime leaned heavily into the idea of a state-managed currency, extended its reach across a vast territory, and tried to unify diverse monetary practices under a more centralized structure. Marco arrives during this era of bold experimentation, and what he sees is impressive enough that he builds a mini treatise around it. He probably does not see every wrinkle. He presents the system as smooth, almost frictionless, bark to paper, seal to value, imperial will to universal acceptance. Our other sources suggest that reality was more jagged. There were episodes of inflation, moments when too much paper chased too few goods, or when confidence in certain issues sagged. Governments before and after the yuan grappled with the temptation to print too freely. In some regions, especially on the edges of the empire or in areas with strong older traditions, metallic money and barter persisted alongside paper. Certain issues were local or limited in scope. Others, like the famous chow, were meant to be more universal but varied in strength over time. People adapted. Some hoarded older, more trusted notes. Others preferred silver for large savings. Regional markets developed their own hierarchies of which forms of money they would accept, and at what discount. In a vast realm, no monetary regime is perfectly uniform. Marco probably moves mostly through zones where the system is working relatively well, or where officials are keen to display its order. His narrative reflects that. It is polished, perhaps selectively so. But even after we correct for that, something important remains. He gets the structure. He understands that the notes are not random scraps. They are bound to specific offices, specific seals, specific rules. He grasps that their value lies in decree, in the threat of punishment, and in the habit of use. He sees that this arrangement allows the state to draw gold and silver inward and push paper outward. In other words, on this topic, he is not merely repeating tavern gossip or recycling stories from other travellers. He is observing a system, asking how it functions, and explaining it in terms that make sense for his listeners. This is why historians often point to the paper money section as one of the strongest pieces of evidence that, wherever exactly he went, Marco had close exposure to Chinese administrative practice. It is the kind of detail that is hard to invent convincingly if you have never watched officials handle accounts and heard merchants complain or praise the convenience. It also fits with the broader portrait we have been building. The same empire that mobilizes ships and caravans, that builds canals and granaries, is also bold enough to rearrange the very form of money. The cities with their countless bridges are plugged into a monetary network as well as a physical one. And just as with his city numbers, it helps to read his description of paper currency, not as a simple fact sheet, but as a clue to what impressed him most. Not the texture of the paper, not the calligraphy, but the quiet, astonishing fact that an emperor could say, "This has value," and in marketplaces he could never visit, among people he would never meet, that statement would hold. From there, it is a short step to another system he notices again and again, one woven even more tightly into everyday life than paper money, and one that underpins much of the Yuan government's actual revenue. The humble crystals and brine that move through salt pans, ledgers and storehouses, and the bureaucracy built to control them. If paper money is the part of Marco's story that sounds like magic, salt is the part that sounds like accounting. He does not gush about it the way he does about palaces or feasts. He does not linger on taste or recipes. When he mentions salt, it is almost always in the same breath as words like revenue, tribute, offices, or the Lord's profit. It is a food, But in his narrative, it is mainly a mechanism. Salt is, in some ways, the perfect thing for a pre-modern state to love. Everyone needs it. Poor people need it. Rich people need it. You cannot easily do without it. It is necessary for preserving meat, for surviving winters and long journeys, for keeping animals healthy. That means you can tax it very heavily, and people will still buy it. You can even make its production and sale a monopoly, and call that monopoly something else. Good order, standardization, imperial protection. Chinese governments had understood this long before the Mongols and the Yuan regime steps into a system that already has deep roots. Marco arrives in a world where the logic is simple but powerful. Let private farmers grow grain. Let merchants argue over silk and spices. But when it comes to certain basics, salt above all, the state inserts itself as gatekeeper. In Marco's account, you see this in the way he describes particular cities and regions. He will say that a place produces incredible quantities of salt. He will mention wells or marshes where brine is boiled down, or pans where seawater is evaporated. But he rarely leaves it at that. Almost immediately he moves to the revenue. He notes, for example, that in one region salt is issued by the Great Khan, and that no one may make it or sell it without a license. He remarks that these licenses themselves can be bought, that they are valuable in their own right, and that through them the ruler makes a vast income. Elsewhere, he describes blocks or cakes of salt, stamped with official marks, circulating almost like currency in certain frontier markets. What he is seeing or hearing described is a bundle of fiscal techniques wrapped around the same commodity. The government can own the salt fields outright. It can grant production rights to certain families or contractors in return for fixed payments. It can tax transport, insisting that every cart and boat that carries the precious crystals stops at checkpoints, registers its cargo, and pays. It can control wholesale markets and leave retail to small traders who buy at state-set prices. For a medieval European reader, the idea that you would tax something everyone needs was not entirely foreign. Salt taxes appear in many societies, but the scale and systematization he hints at in Yuan China are different. It is not just that salt is taxed, it is that its movement is mapped. And this brings us to the part of his narrative that can sound, on first reading, dry: tax rolls, census registers, transport routes, tribute chains. These are the passages where he starts talking in numbers again, not about the population of a city this time, but about how many towns pay into a treasury, how many boats carry grain or salt along a canal, how much revenue flows to the court each year. He almost certainly exaggerates the sums. The precise figures, hundreds of thousands of bezants, millions in gold, are better read as signals of very large than as audited accounts. But the mechanisms he describes track closely with what Chinese and Persian sources tell us about how the Yuan state tried to feed its core and finance its ambitions. At the heart of that system is information. To tax people regularly, you need to know who they are, where they live, what they do. You need names, households, fields, workshops. The Mongol rulers inherit and modify Chinese traditions of household registration and census taking. They experiment with new categories, with classifications that separate farmers from artisans, commoners from those tied to military or administrative service. They use these registers to allocate grain levies, corvée labour, and increasingly monetary taxes. Marco does not give a bureaucrat's manual. He does not recite law codes. But he keeps bumping into the surface effects of these efforts. He notices that certain provinces send very specific quantities of grain or silk or spices to the capital each year. He hears about how many barges are maintained on major canals to move tax grain northwards toward the court and the garrisons. He tells us that when the Great Khan orders a new palace or a grand feast, The goods are not scraped together at the last minute. They flow from regions whose obligations are long established. From the perspective of his Venetian world, where city-states tax trade at gates and harbours and squeeze revenue where they can, this decently organised web of obligations is both alien and impressive. It suggests a government that not only conquers but counts. This is why some historians regard these fiscal passages as among the more trustworthy parts of his report. They are not especially glamorous. They do not read like copying from romances or travellers' tales. They do not require much imagination to invent, but they do require a certain kind of patience to observe. You do not learn about salt monopolies and tax quotas just by drifting through bazaars. You learn about them because officials complain or boast, because merchants grumble about duties at checkpoints, because someone explains why a caravan route bends in one direction rather than another to pass by an inspection station, a granary, a tax office. Foreigners in Yuan-era China, especially those involved in trade or minor service, would have been steeped in this kind of talk. A Persian merchant might explain how he has to buy official salt at one depot and sell it at another. A local clerk might hint at the profits to be made in farming out certain tax rights. A Mongol officer might brag about the revenue his district sends up the chain each year as a sign of his competence. Over time, with a curious mind and a willingness to listen, you could assemble a mosaic of how the empire makes its money. You would not see every tile, but you would start to notice patterns, that roads are not just for merchants, they are for tax grain and salt, that canals are not just wonders of engineering, they are arteries of state revenue, that census efforts are not just temporary intrusions, they are the skeleton on which levies are hung. In Marco's telling, these patterns keep pointing back to a familiar centre, the court. Kublai's regime, ruling over what had once been several different Chinese states, plus vast non-Chinese territories, faces a double challenge. It needs to extract wealth from an extraordinarily productive agrarian and commercial base, and it needs to do so without letting that base fracture into independent power blocks. It must bind regions that differ in language, custom and prior institutions into a single network of obligation. Salt and taxation, as he glimpses them, are tools for this. A salt monopoly does more than raise money. It gives the central government leverage over coastal provinces and inland basins alike. A census does more than count mouths. It tells the court where labour and soldiers can be drawn, where grain surpluses exist, where new transport routes might be justified. A canal filled with tax grain does more than feed a capital. It proves every season that orders in one place are obeyed hundreds of miles away. This is one of the core logics of Mongol governance that appears again and again when you read across sources. A conquering elite that is initially small in number, leans heavily on existing administrative frameworks, but pushes them toward more systematic extraction. They accept diversity of local practice, different currencies, different laws in some domains, so long as the tribute flows and communications remain open. They are pragmatic about religion relative to many contemporaries, but less flexible when it comes to taxes and transport. Marco does not spell this out in modern terms, but you can hear him circling it. His China is not held together primarily by shared culture in his eyes. It is held together by roots, records, and revenues. He seems genuinely fascinated by the machinery of this. The paper money section, the salt passages, the repeated notes about how many cities pay into this or that province, these are not accidental. They reveal a traveller drawn not just to surfaces, but to systems. And that, in turn, shapes the China he brings back to Europe. It is not mainly a land of sages and poets in his account, although he occasionally gestures at learning. It is a realm where the ruler's will is made real through clerks and storehouses, where everyday necessities are touched by invisible fingers of the state, where the miracle is not a single marvel, but the fact that so many moving parts salt fields, granaries, caravans, canal locks, registers, seals appear to work in concert. Seen this way, even the more dramatic parts of his story, the hunts, the palaces, the festivals, float on top of something quieter but more important. Underneath the noise of drums and the shimmer of silk, there is the dull scratch of brushes on paper, the slap of seals on documents, the creak of barges loaded with tax grain and government salt. Once you notice that, other parts of his book start to look different too. The cities, the ports, the caravans he praises are not just impressive in themselves. They are nodes in a larger system that someone is counting, taxing, and routing. And if you follow that thread a little further, it leads you out of the inland salt pans and riverways and toward another set of places where Marco's curiosity wakes up again. The seaports on China's southern coast, where the empire meets the wider ocean, and where this inland web of taxes and monopolies spills out into maritime trade. If the canals and salt roads are the empire's internal veins, the southern ports are where the blood meets the sea. When Marco's narrative turns toward places like Quanzhou and the harbours of what he calls Zaitun or Chin Kalan, the tone shifts slightly. The counting and fiscal mechanism talk is still there, but it's wrapped now in something he understands on a more instinctive level: shipping. He is, after all, from Venice. His childhood skyline would have been masts and campanili. Harbour dues, customs houses, dock gossip. These are not abstractions for him. They are the background noise of his life. So when he reaches the rim of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean trading world, he is suddenly on familiar ground, even if the ships look different and the monsoon winds have names he has never heard before. He notices ships. He notices how many there are, how big, how they are built, how many sails they carry, how they are caulked and compartmented. But he also notices what is done with them, where they go, what they carry, who taxes them, and who profits. In Quanzhou, the great port of Fujian, he describes something like a medieval Venice turned inside out. Instead of being the proud endpoint of caravans coming from the east, this is the place where China pours itself outward. Goods flow down from the interior by river, canal, and road, and then fan out again by sea, south toward what he calls India, west toward the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, island hopping through Southeast Asia. Modern historians situate Quanzhou firmly inside the Indian Ocean world, one node among many in a vast monsoon-timed web stretching from East Africa to southern China. Contemporary Arab and Persian writers do the same. Marco, without those maps, still feels the pattern. He knows enough to say that ships come here from many lands, that they winter here waiting for the right winds, that they return stuffed with Chinese goods and foreign wares. What he lingers on are customs and commodities. Again and again in his descriptions of coastal provinces, he notes that the great Khan's revenue from maritime trade is tremendous. He writes of duties levied on incoming and outgoing ships, of official brokers of weighed and measured cargoes. Sometimes he gives percentages, a portion for the ruler, a portion for the ship owner, a portion for the merchant. The numbers may not be exact, but the structure, the idea that sea trade is not a chaotic scramble but a system with rules, is clear. You can almost hear the conversations that might have fed these passages. A Persian captain grumbling over wine that the duties in this Chinese port are higher than in Hormuz. A local clerk explaining how foreign merchants are registered, which goods are exempt, which are particularly valued by the court. An Arab sailor boasting about a run of pepper that paid off the ship's taxes and left a fortune besides. Marco turns those fragments into narrative. To keep his readers oriented, he anchors his port descriptions in lists of goods. These lists are not just inventories, they are a kind of storytelling. Each commodity is a hook that ties distant oceans back to a European imagination. Silk is the first and most obvious. He insists that the finest silks in endless varieties come from the Chinese interior, but it is through the ports that they reach the wider world. He mentions brocades and cloths embroidered with gold, fabrics dyed in colours that feel, in his telling, almost supernatural in their richness. He does not need to explain to a Venetian why this matters. Silk is already a dream in his readers' minds. He is merely changing the scale from rumour to river. Then comes ceramics. He does not use the word porcelain, but he talks about fine, delicate wares that are almost translucent, that can be bought cheaply in their place of origin and sold dearly abroad. He notes that foreign merchants load their ships with these bowls, vases and dishes, because everywhere along the Indian Ocean rim, people are willing to pay for them. In a world of rough pottery and wooden trenchers, the idea of a white, resonant cup that rings like a bell when struck is a marvel, and he treats it that way. Spices flow through these same ports, but here the direction is often reversed. China produces some aromatics of its own, but Marco is keenly aware that pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other prized flavours come from further south and west, from the islands and peninsulas of Southeast Asia, from India, from beyond. In his telling, the Chinese ports are both exporters and importers, silk and ceramics going out, spices and certain medicinal substances coming in, to be consumed by elites or re-exported inland. Metals and gems form another layer. He talks of gold dust and ingots, of silver, of copper and iron, used for tools and weapons. He mentions pearls from nearby seas and precious stones that travel much farther, rubies, sapphires and other oriental gems brought by foreign merchants. To a European reader, these are the same items that appear in biblical stories, crusader chronicles and courtly romances. By placing them in Chinese harbours, Marco is folding China into a known world of treasure. Even humbler goods make appearances: lacquerware, paper, sugar, dried fish, salt itself. Individually they might not glow with romance, but together they sketch a picture of ports that are not just places of exotic luxury but of everyday provisioning, great mouths that eat and spit out cargoes with every season. Around these goods he sees or is told about people. Quanzhou in his account is not simply a Chinese city. It is implicitly multi-ethnic. He notes the presence of Saracens, his usual term for Muslims, of Indians, of merchants from many kingdoms. Other sources describe mosques, Christian churches, Hindu temples, Persian graveyards, an entire patchwork of communities living under Yuan authority yet facing the sea. Marco is interested in this diversity, but he tends to filter it through function. People are defined by what they trade, what ships they own, what taxes they pay. Persians bring certain goods, Arabs others. Some foreigners gain favour at court because they can supply rare items or manage difficult shipping routes. The port becomes a meeting point not only of cultures but of fiscal interests. This is also the part of his narrative where the boundary between what he saw and what he heard becomes hardest to draw. It is entirely plausible that he visited at least one of the great ports himself. His route as he leaves China probably takes him by sea from the coast to Southeast Asia and India, and his descriptions of ship construction and monsoon sailing are detailed enough that many scholars think they reflect first-hand experience. At the same time, the Indian Ocean is a storytelling machine. Sailors and merchants trapped in port for months between seasonal winds have nothing but time to talk. They tell each other over and over about distant harbours, dangerous reefs, generous or greedy customs officials, miraculous escapes. Information circulates, mutates and settles into shared lore. Marco would have sat in the middle of this, listening. Some of his port descriptions, especially those dealing with places beyond China, look very much like what you get when you take harbour gossip and lay it out in careful prose. A story about a storm in one place gets attached to another. A particular ruler's customs reforms are generalized to a whole coast. But the basic picture of a connected seascape, of Chinese ports deeply plugged into routes that run all the way to the Gulf and beyond, lines up with what we know from Arabic, Persian and Chinese records. This is where his Maritime China rubs against our later habits of imagination. For a long time, when people in Europe and then elsewhere said Silk Road, they meant caravans crossing deserts, camel trains filing past dunes, walled oasis towns on endless plains. The mental image is almost entirely overland. China, in that picture, is a land power at the eastern end of a ribbon of sand. Marco's book can be read that way if you only look at certain chapters. He certainly describes caravan routes, mountain passes and inland cities. But once you pay attention to how much space he gives to ports, ships, customs dues and seaborne trade, another pattern emerges. His China is not just the terminus of a land road. It is also a coastline deeply stitched into a maritime world, one that in his time is at least as important as the caravans. The goods he lists in the ports are not the leftovers of overland trade. They are mainline cargoes in their own right. The customs he describes at harbours are not peripheral taxes. They are major pillars of imperial revenue. The foreign merchants he meets are not occasional visitors. They are settled communities whose lives are organised around predictable winds and regular voyages. By highlighting these things, whether consciously or simply by following his own curiosity, Marco preserves a snapshot of a world in which the boundary between Silk Road and Sea Lane barely exists. Cloth moves by camel and by ship, pepper travels in saddlebags and in hulls, information and coin cross from one medium to the other so often that from the perspective of Quanzhou, the desert and the ocean are just different kinds of distance. He does not theorize this. He does not step back and say, behold, a unified Afro-Eurasian trading system. That is our language, not his. But his attention, his insistence on telling you how many ships, how much customs, how many merchants, points to a reality that later romantic visions of the Silk Road tend to flatten out. In his pages, China is an empire of routes. Some of those routes are rivers and canals laden with tax grain and salt. Some are roads over mountains and steppe, with relay stations and caravanserais. And some are sea lanes, marked not by milestones but by stars, winds and seasonal rains, carrying cargoes that smell of spices and sound like coin when they are unloaded on stone quays. Once you see that, the next question practically asks itself, if this many foreigners, this much wealth, and this level of organisation are swirling through China's ports and harbours, what happens when he fails to mention certain very famous Chinese things at all? What does he see and not see when he stands at the hinge between this maritime world and the land behind it? To answer that, we have to look not just at what he describes in detail, but at the silences that puzzle modern readers, the missing tea, the quiet about the Great Wall, the things he skips over in a land he otherwise seems eager to measure and count. For more than a century, a certain kind of reading of Marco Polo has loved the silences more than the sentences. You will see it again and again in modern discussions. The list is almost ritualized. He doesn't mention tea. He doesn't mention footbinding. He doesn't describe the Great Wall as we picture it on postcards. Therefore, some say he cannot possibly have been in China. Case closed. It feels satisfying, like catching a magician with a mirror out of place. We know that China is the land of tea and the Great Wall. He does not say so. Gotcha. But the gotcha only works if the China in your head is the same China that existed in the late 1200s. And if you assume that a Venetian merchant working through a Genoese ghostwriter in a prison, with multiple manuscripts drifting off into different languages, would have noticed and preserved exactly the same details we would, neither of those assumptions is as solid as they sound. Start with tea. Tea drinking in China by the Yuan period is absolutely real. It has centuries of history behind it. Elite literati in earlier dynasties had already written poems about tea, argued about whisking versus steeping, fussed over water quality and kettle shape. In some regions, tea is a daily drink, as ordinary as water. But ordinary is the point. By the 13th century, under Mongol rule, tea is a normal domestic commodity in much of China, especially in the south. It is grown, taxed, transported, consumed. Yet it is not necessarily a spectacle to a foreign merchant operating at court and along major trade routes. He is not walking into tea houses as a cultural tourist, asking for an explanation of every cup. He is talking to officials about paper money, about salt, about horses, about ships. He does mention drinking and banquets. He does describe rice, wine, and other liquors, and he pays attention when something feels strange to his palate. The absence of a little word like tea may say less about Chinese habits and more about narrative priorities. In a world where people drink many infusions, broths, and fermented beverages, boiling leaves in water may not strike him as the exotic thing to highlight for European readers who have never heard of it and have no category for it yet. Then footbinding. Here, the timeline matters even more. Tiny bound feet as a nearly universal marker of Han Chinese femininity is a much later development. In Marco's time, the practice exists, but it is neither universal nor particularly visible to a foreign man moving in Mongol and mixed ethnic circles. It likely begins centuries earlier in certain elite Song court environments, spreads slowly among urban upper classes, and only over time filters downward and outward. Under the Yuan, the ruling stratum around Kublai Khan is heavily Mongol and Central Asian. Mongol women are famously active on horseback, managing estates, moving with the army. Their culture does not bind feet. In some regions, non-Han or frontier populations don't either. Marco's main vantage point, as far as we can reconstruct it, is not a quiet Jiangnan scholar's household where a visiting poet would comment on embroidered slippers and the delicate gait of ladies. It is an imperial court where the emperor's wives and daughters are more likely to be riding and hunting, and administrative environments populated by Muslim, Central Asian and Northern Chinese clerks. Even in more Han Chinese cities, a foreign merchant's daily contacts are male. The domestic spaces where bound feet are present are behind walls, out of his line of sight, and deeply inappropriate for him to inspect. It is not that the practice doesn't matter, it would become one of the most charged symbols of old China centuries later. But in the 1270s and 1280s, from the vantage point of a guest in Mongol-dominated circles, it may not register as a key feature of the empire. It may look like one more regional class-marking custom among many he has no frame to interpret. And then the Great Wall. Here, the dissonance between our mental image and his historical moment is strongest. When most people say the Great Wall, they're thinking of the long stone and brick fortifications in northern China, with crenellated battlements and watchtowers striding across mountains like a single continuous dragon. That iconic version is largely a Ming project, built and rebuilt after the Mongols are expelled in the mid-14th century, as a way of keeping steppe powers out. Marco is in China during the height of Mongol power, when steppe forces have burst through earlier barriers and rule from Beijing to the Persian Gulf. For his hosts, walls are not triumphant symbols of civilization keeping barbarians at bay. They are, in many cases, obsolete lines from conquered regimes or local defensive works in ongoing frontier fighting. Even before the Mongols, Chinese Great Walls are not one monolithic thing. They are systems, rammed earth lines, fortresses, beacon towers, ditches, palisades, built in fits and starts by different states and dynasties. They erode, are abandoned, are patched up in particular sectors. Travellers might pass through gates or see stretches of ramparts, but they do not necessarily conceptualize them as a single nameable wonder, the Great Wall of China, in the way a 19th century tourist might. Chinese sources of Marco's time do talk about border defences, passes, and fortifications, but the breathless, wall-centric language we know comes later, layered on by Ming officials and then by modern nationalism and tourism. If Marco rode with Mongol envoys through northern passes, he may very well have seen walls. He may have crossed old defences, whose importance his guides no longer emphasise. To him they could blend into the broader category of fortified towns and strong places that he does mention repeatedly, without deserving a special chapter. There is no single word Great Wall attached to imprint itself in his memory or his ghostwriter's Latin. When you put these three together, footbinding walls, the pattern becomes less like smoking gun and more like angled flashlight. His narrative beam is pointed at certain things: imperial rituals, taxes, roads, ports, strange animals, commercial opportunities, legal practices, domestic daily life, inner female spaces, and old frontiers that no longer define power are in the shadows. Part of this is simply who he is. He is male, elite by European standards, but a subordinate at the great Khan's court, interested in trade and administration. His informants are other men in similar or adjacent positions. They talk about the emperor's hunts and postal relays and census methods, not about how their sisters' shoes are sewn. Part of it is where he is. The Mongol Yuan court is a hybrid institution, with multiple traditions in play. Many of the features people now label as quintessentially Chinese become standardized or symbolically central in later dynasties, especially the Ming and the Qing, whose records and architecture shape Western views of China in the early modern period. We are used to looking at China through Ming glasses and then being annoyed that a 13th century text doesn't match the view, and part of it has to do with the way his book is made. The text that goes under Marco's name is not a single pristine autograph carefully preserved in a climate-controlled archive. It is a work told aloud in a prison to Rustichello of Pisa, a writer used to crafting Romance literature. Rustichello shapes, smooths, organises, scribes, copy, abridge, translate into French, Latin, Tuscan, Venetian, adding glosses or compressing sections. It is entirely possible that somewhere between Marco's memory and a later copyist's pen, small asides about a bitter leaf drink or delicate shoes drop out as less important than a long digression on the wealth of a city or the marvels of a gemstone island. Medieval manuscripts are full of such quiet losses. We do not know exactly what was trimmed, we only see what survived. Rustichello also has his own sense of what makes a good story for a European audience used to Arthurian legends and Crusader tales. He leans into wonders that resonate: huge palaces, armies the size of small kingdoms, strange animals, golden rivers. The daily detail of how people in Hangzhou start their morning, or how women in Fujian strap their feet, may not strike him as worth precious parchment. Once you start thinking this way, the omissions stop looking like proof that the whole journey was invented, and start looking like small windows into his vantage point. He is not writing an ethnographic handbook, ticking off checklists of Chinese culture. He is narrating what struck him, and what he thought would strike his listeners, filtered through a collaborator and multiplied through copies. Where he is precise and oddly interested: paper money, salt taxes, canal logistics, ship construction, we learn a great deal about what the Yuan world looked like to a merchant from Venice. Where he is silent, we learn something too. Not that the thing didn't exist, but that for him and his circle it did not define China. The exercise, then, is not to tally every absence and declare him guilty, but to ask a different question, given who he is, where he moves, and how his words travel to us. What kind of China can we reasonably expect him to show? Once that question is on the table, another layer of his narrative starts to come into focus. The religious rites, the miracles, the marvels he chooses to highlight. Because if tea and walls can vanish in the gaps between vision and text, what does it mean when certain beliefs, shrines and wonders make it through loud and clear? If you keep that in mind, the angled flashlight, the moving manuscript, his religious and wonder stories start to look different. Medieval travel writing is not a GoPro feed, it is a braid. One strand is observation, things someone saw or heard fairly directly. Another is moral interpretation, sorting those things into familiar Christian categories: virtuous, sinful, idolatrous, providential. The third strand is marvel. The delight in telling of places where the normal rules seem to bend. Marco's book is no exception. It lives where those strands twist together. When he talks about religion in the lands of the Great Khan, he does not draw a neat map the way a modern textbook might. Buddhism over here, Taoism there, Islam along these trade routes, Christianity tucked in this corner. He has fewer labels to work with, and most of them are moral rather than descriptive. People who worship one god with a book and some version of Abraham in the background tend to become Christians or Saracens. Everyone else, from Himalayan monks to village spirit mediums, risks being sorted under a single broad word: idolaters. It is not that he cannot tell them apart at all. Sometimes he can. He notices lamas in their monasteries, describes them as wearing a distinctive habit, shaving their heads, living in communities, chanting and burning incense before images. There are hints we can recognize: large monasteries, statues of Buddhas, prayer rituals. But instead of calling them Buddhists, a word not yet in his Latin vocabulary, he sees them as a type he already understands: monks who serve idols. He does something similar with what we would now call folk religion. In city after city, he mentions people making offerings to local spirits or images for good luck in trade, safe voyages, fertile fields. He notes how they hang up strips of cloth at sacred trees, or bring gifts to a particular shrine because they believe it controls the weather or the health of their children. All of that gets filed under idolatry as well, even though on the ground these practices may be drawing from very different traditions: Taoist, Buddhist, local cults, ancestral rites. Islam, by contrast, he recognizes more clearly. Muslim merchants, judges and administrators were deeply embedded in the Mongol world that Marco moves through. He sees their mosques. He hears the call to prayer. He knows about fasting in Ramadan and circumcision and certain dietary laws. When he talks about them, they are not idolaters. They are Saracens, following the law of Muhammad. He is ambivalent. On the one hand, he respects their commercial skills and sometimes praises their honesty or courage. On the other hand, he criticizes them sharply when they oppose Christian interests, or when he believes their influence harms the Christians within the empire. Christianity itself appears in his narrative as a scattered but stubborn presence. He describes Nestorian churches in Central Asia and in parts of China, communities that had been there for centuries, praying in Syriac, venerating the cross. He tells stories of crosses standing by royal roads, of churches supported by Mongol rulers, of Christian queens and consorts at court. But his language about them is filtered through Latin categories. Christians, in his text, do not map neatly onto Roman Catholics. They include Eastern churches with different liturgies and theology, people who would have looked odd or even suspect to a Venetian priest. Yet in the story they become a single camp. The Christians, struggling under the weight of idolaters and Saracens, occasionally delivered by miracles. This is where the moralized marvel begins to seep in. Consider one type of story he repeats: the contest miracle. In one version, people of different religions pray for rain or for a sign. The idolaters invoke their gods. The Muslims theirs, the Christians theirs. For a time, nothing happens. Then, after fervent Christian prayers or the intervention of a holy man, the sky breaks open or a mountain moves a little or an event occurs that embarrasses the non-Christians. The ruler is impressed. Favour shifts toward the Christians, at least for a while, to a modern ear. This sounds like a pious legend. It probably is. But it doesn't require that he never saw anything at all. It requires that what he saw or heard second-hand was retold and polished in a familiar medieval pattern, where history becomes a stage for spiritual rivalry. Translation traps amplify this effect. Rusticello and the scribes who copy him do not have a technical vocabulary for Tibetan Buddhism, Taoist alchemy, or Chinese ancestor rites. They reach for what they know. A bodhisattva, or local protective deity, becomes a saint, but one serving demons. A monastery becomes a church, except that in this church they worship idols. A religious festival with processions and lanterns becomes a great feast, sounding almost like a Christian holiday, except for the wrong god. Even simple terms shift. Words that mean merit, karma, or auspiciousness in local languages get rendered in Latin or French as blessing or grace or fortune. The underlying ideas are not identical. But on the page they start to blur. When he says that people believe a certain statue gives health or forgives sins, if you make offerings, it is hard to know whether that reflects what his informant said, or how his translator understood it, or the moral slant a Christian narrator wanted the reader to feel. Then there are the outlandish details: dog-headed tribes, miraculous springs, mountains that float, demons in the desert, islands where people never fall ill, stones that burn like wood, men whose shadows bring plague. These are the points where readers either lean in with delight or pull back in suspicion. How, you might ask, can we trust him about tax systems if he also repeats tales of men with tails? One answer is that medieval audiences did not draw a sharp line between geography and bestiary. The world beyond familiar horizons was thought to contain both strange peoples and strange creatures. Classical authorities like Pliny had already written about dog-headed men and one-footed shade-dwellers. Christian sermons used such beings as moral symbols. A good travel narrative in this context is almost expected to brush against that tradition. If you travelled to the edge of the known world and came back with nothing wondrous to report, you had not looked very hard, or you were concealing something. So when Marco describes people in distant islands with odd customs, or repeats a story about a miraculous plant animal that grows as a lamb on a stalk, he is participating in a genre, not necessarily fabricating from scratch. Notice where the densest clusters of marvels appear. Often they sit at edges, near the borders of the empire, in far-off islands, in mountainous regions he likely did not visit personally. The more distant the place, the more extravagant the tale. Coastal provinces, close to the main trade routes, get relatively sober treatment: markets, taxes, ports, certain religious customs. Distant lands toward India, Southeast Asia, or the Arctic get more monsters, more sorceries, more saints battling demons. That gradient matters. It suggests that his flashlight is brightest where he travels or has solid informants, and fuzzier at the margins where hearsay and inherited Marvel stories seep in. He is mixing his own observations with what others have long said about the wider world. The trick, then, is not to throw out the whole book when you hit a miracle. It is to ask, where is this story sitting? Is it attached to a well-travelled city he clearly knows in detail, or to a vague island he never clearly locates? Is he giving you big numbers and marvels in the same breath as tax rates and mail stations, or does his tone shift into more obviously exemplary mode where the moral point is more important than the geography. Reading Marco this way is less about catching him in a lie, and more about tuning your ear to the layers in his voice. There is the merchant, fascinated by how paper promises command silver. There is the Christian, eager to show that God sometimes vindicates his people even in the land of idolaters. There is the medieval storyteller, satisfying listeners who expect giants on distant shores and holy men who humble kings. All three are speaking at once. If you listen carefully, you can start to separate them, not to purify the text into something modern and sterile, but to understand what kind of knowledge each layer offers. The Marvel stories, read with curiosity but caution, tell us what Europeans in his world found astonishing, frightening, or morally instructive about Asia. The religious labels, handled gently, show us where his categories fit awkwardly over complex local realities. The quieter details in the middle of those same chapters, how many monks a monastery feeds, what taxes fall on pilgrims, how different faiths coexist under Mongol rule, give glimpses of the Yuan religious landscape that no bestiary could invent. And when his voice slides most fully into legend, at the far edges of the map, that too is information. It tells you where direct sight gives way to the long echo of stories, and where the China in his pages begins to blur into a larger, dreamlike Asia of wonders. From that blurred edge, his narrative will soon return to firmer ground, to the names of provinces, the divisions of Cathay and Mangi, the puzzle of how his Sipangu and Kamba Alay line up, or fail to line up, with the China we can trace on maps today. When he does return, he does not say, "Now we are in China." The word China, in anything like our modern sense, is not the main label in his toolkit. Instead, two other names do most of the work, Cathay and Mangi. They sound exotic, but they are not fantasy. They are fossils of politics. Cathay is, in rough terms, North China under Mongol rule. Its roots lie in Khitan, the name of a steppe people who once ruled large parts of northern China centuries before the Mongols. Muslim geographers picked up that name, reshaped it into forms like Hittite and Kitai, and used it as a label for the northern realms beyond the Gobi. By the time Marco is listening to Persian and Turkic merchants at caravansarays along the Silk Road, Cathay has become the standard Western Asian way to talk about the rich, settled northern heartland that the Mongols have taken. Mangi, by contrast, is a Mongol and Persian way of talking about the south. The term likely comes from something like Manzi or southern barbarians, a label the conquering north uses for the people of the former Song dynasty lands, Jiangnan, Fujian, the lower Yangtze, the wet rice plains and crowded cities stretching toward the sea. So when Marco divides the empire into Cathay and Mangi, he is not just drawing a north-south line on a map. He is inhabiting the world view of the empire he travels through. For Mongol administrators and the Muslim secretaries who serve them, the old Song South is a conquered world with its own history, its own elites, and a slightly suspect identity. It has been subdued, taxed, reorganized. It will feed the empire with grain and silver. The northern territories, the old Jin lands, the long Sinified zones closer to the original Mongol power base, stand in a different relationship to the court. They are closer to the steppe heartlands, closer to the older capitals, more tightly woven into the Mongol story of themselves. Marco's words echo that. He talks about the province of Cathay as a place with big walled cities, printed paper, sophisticated administration. He also talks about the province of Mangi as a late conquest, full of wealthy cities that held out, were besieged, and were finally taken. To us both are China. To him they are two regions inside a much larger imperial machine, and their names carry traces of conquest, hierarchy, and contempt. Those names do not come to him in a vacuum. Marco is moving through a multilingual relay system. The Mongol Empire runs, in large part, on Persian-speaking administrators, Muslim merchants, Uyghur scribes, and local Chinese officials who have learned how to talk to all of them. Place names pass through these mouths before they reach his. A city might have one name in the local Chinese dialect, another in the official written Chinese of state documents, a third in Mongolian, and a fourth in Persian. A Persian merchant tells Marco about Kambalu, a Persian-inflected rendering of what Mongol officials call Kambalik, the city of the Khan. A Chinese clerk would know the same place as Dadu, the great capital. Later, Europeans will simply call it Peking, then Beijing. On the page, only one of these wins. Cathay itself is a Persian lens over Chinese reality. Mangi is a Mongol Persian lens over a southern Chinese world that once called itself something entirely different. So when you feel the itch to say, "He got China wrong," it helps to remember that the categories and words you are holding in your head did not exist for him in that form. He is not mislabeling a stable country. He is faithfully relaying an empire's own way of slicing itself up. Now imagine trying to line that up on a map, when there are no standardized atlases, no longitude and latitude, and the borders themselves keep moving. Marco knows directions in terms of routes and days of travel. From such a place you ride so many days east to reach this city. From there, you travel south for a month to reach that province by river. Mountains and deserts mark the edges more than clean political lines. Couple that with changing names, and the ground starts to wobble. The same city might be described in different parts of the text by a name inherited from an older dynasty, a Mongol name and a foreign merchant's version of one of those. Later scribes copy those words, sometimes garble them, sometimes correct them according to their own ideas. Centuries afterward, a European scholar tries to match Xiangan, Qinsai, Yangyu, Kamba Ale to a printed Qing or Republican map, and finds that some of them fit neatly, others only roughly, and a few refuse to stay put at all. This is why some of his identifications remain debated. Is his Qinsai, that marvellously large city with 100 bridges, really Hangzhou, the old southern Song capital? Most scholars think so, but they will still argue over details of layout and description. Is Shangan truly Xi'an, or is it a scribble corruption of some other place entirely? Does Tenduk correspond to a specific region in Inner Mongolia, or is it a fuzzier frontier zone that migrates as Mongol control shifts? Historians propose, counterpropose, and sometimes simply admit that the trail is too faint. Sometimes the problem is that two plausible identifications exist. The distances he gives between cities are not measured with odometers. They are estimates in days of travel that can balloon or shrink with terrain, weather, or narrative convenience. A great river might mean the Yellow, the Yangtze, or even a lesser tributary, depending on the informant. So the jigsaw puzzle of his geography never quite clicks into a single stable picture. Still, for falling asleep with some sense of orientation, you can hold a simple mental map. Picture a big rectangle for China under Kublai Khan. Draw a horizontal band across the middle. North of that band, you are in what Marco calls Cathay. South of it, you are in Mangi. Up in Cathay, imagine the capital, Kambalu, Kanbalik, Dadu, modern Beijing, anchoring the northeast. Radiating from it, there are postal routes, roads with relay stations where fresh horses wait, carrying orders, tax reports, intelligence, and travellers like Marco. Those roads shoot westward toward Central Asia, northward onto the steppe, and southward into the riverlands. Down in Mangi, imagine a great curved belt of cities hugging the rivers and the coast. Hangzhou, or Qinsai in his spelling, sits like a jewel at the eastern end of the old Grand Canal, a city whose size he can hardly stop talking about. Further south and west, ports like Zaitun, usually linked to modern Gwangju, open onto the maritime routes he praises. From those ports, ships fan out to Southeast Asia, to Zipangu, Japan, to India, and beyond. Inland, rivers and canals move grain, salt, and people northward, feeding Kublai's capital and the garrisons that hold the south. This is Marco's China. Not a neat outline on a schoolroom map, but a web of roads and waterways, moored to two big names. Cathay on top, Mangi below, both inside a larger thing he calls the Empire of the Great Khan. Once you see that, his mistakes look different. When he calls northern Chinese Cathayans and southern Chinese people of Mangi, he is not denying that they share a civilizational background. He is reflecting the way the Mongol state has sorted, taxed and governed them as distinct populations. When he barely uses China, he is not failing to recognize a country. He is using the terms everyone around him is using, terms that stress conquest and division rather than unity. Later European readers opening printed editions of his book with their own ideas of China already forming from Jesuit letters and later maps try to force his categories to match theirs. If a city they think of as typically Chinese is listed under Mangi, they accuse him of confusion. If a northern custom appears in a southern province, they suspect fabrication. But the problem is often not that he is wrong about the place. It is that he and the reader are stacking two different mental maps on top of each other and expecting them to line up perfectly. His is Mongol administrative, carried in the heads of Persian secretaries and caravan traders. Theirs is a growing early modern geography that wants China to be a single named entity, with clear borders and a capital you can circle on an atlas. The friction between those two ways of carving the world helps explain why, even today, discussions of his accuracy can slide into talking past each other. One side points to mismatched names and shifting provinces. The other points to economic details, postal routes, and court procedures that fit Yuan China remarkably well. Both are staring at the same text. They are just using different templates. If you hold Marco's own template in mind, Cathay above, Mangi below, bound together under the Great Khan, linked by roads, rivers, and a shared but fractured civilization, the picture settles. He may not be seeing China the way we would draw it. He is seeing something else, a conquered country still wearing the names its conquerors gave, cities with many labels, frontiers that blur, a landscape where identity is not one solid colour, but a patchwork of regions, loyalties and languages. From that patchwork, later Europe will build its own idea of China, turning Cathay into a poetic echo, Mangi into a puzzle, and Marco himself into both witness and legend. For a long time after his death, Marco's book was not a monument. It was a tool. It moved the way useful things move in the late Middle Ages, by being copied, trimmed, expanded, translated, adapted to the needs of whoever was holding the pen. There is no single, stable, original text of the travels of Marco Polo. What we have instead is a family of manuscripts. Some in a rough Franco-Italian, the language a Venetian merchant and a Pisan writer might improvise together in a Genoese prison. Some in Latin, given a more scholarly polish. Some in various European vernaculars, where scribes quietly adjust words that feel foreign or add a gloss or skip a boring section on taxes to jump to the next wonder. Each copy is an interpretation. A clerk in Venice, copying for a merchant patron, might make sure that the parts about routes, distances and trade goods are clear. A monk in Burgundy copying for a monastic library might care more about marvels, monsters and moral lessons. A royal translator preparing a version for a French or Castilian court might emphasize the grandeur of the Great Khan as a way of reflecting, by contrast or comparison, on European kingship. So, from very early on, the book of Marco Polo is not a fixed window onto Yuan China. It is a moving target. As it moves, certain bits get sticky. Merchants latch onto practical details, that there are markets for furs and cloth in certain ports, that pearls and spices come by particular sea routes, that paper money is accepted in the big urban centres, that the empire runs on relay stations where you can find horses and lodging. Map makers latch onto place names and broad directions. Even if the distances are fuzzy and the identifications debated, Cathay, Mangi, and Zaitun provide anchors. On some medieval maps you can see these words drifting along the parchment surface, attached to crude outlines of land masses, a kind of wishful geography based on stories. Would-be explorers latch on to the very existence of a rich, ordered, urban civilization far to the east. To a Genoese sailor wondering what lies beyond the western horizon, Marco's book becomes less a travelogue and more a catalogue of riches that might be reached by some other route. By the early 15th century, Portuguese navigators along the African coast are listening to older stories about the East, and Marco's account sits in the background like a remembered rumour. By the late 15th century, Christopher Columbus owns a copy. He annotates it. He underlines passages about provinces rich in gold, about islands off the Asian coast, about Cipangu, Japan, as a place of extraordinary wealth. He believes, or wants to believe, that by sailing west he can tap into this network of places Marco describes. The book in his hands is not just a description of what once was. It is a projection screen for what might be found. At the same time, something subtler is happening in European reading habits. As centuries pass and written records grow more abundant, the way people relate text to reality shifts. A medieval reader is used to compilations. Chronicles and saints' lives regularly braid together first-hand experience, hearsay, older authorities, and moralized digressions, all without a clear line announcing which is which. Marco's book fits comfortably into that pattern, but later readers, especially in the early modern period, begin to want something else. They like diaries, letters, eyewitness narratives with a single named I at the centre. So they start to slide Marco's book into that genre in their minds. The fact that he dictated to Rustichello of Pisa, a professional writer of romances, fades into the background. The fact that Rustichello almost certainly shaped, reordered, and sometimes embroidered the material is background noise. What rises to the surface is the idea of Marco Polo as a solitary observer, moving like a camera through an exotic world, recording everything with cool precision. The temptation is to read the book as if it were a modern field notebook. They do this, every number, every custom, taken as something seen with his own eyes, jotted down at the time. When the text says, I, Marco, have seen this, the emphasis falls on the I. When it says, they say, or when it moves into long catalogues of regions he could not possibly have visited in person, those signals are easy to skim past. Over time, this selective reading helps push the book along a path from sourcebook to legend. In that legend, Marco is no longer just a Venetian merchant embedded in a Mongol system, listening to many voices and relaying them later. He becomes the first European to the first European to describe paper money. The first European to reach Kublai Khan's court. The first European to travel all the way to China. The first European to bring back accurate knowledge of the Far East. Each of those phrases looks clean on the page. Each of them smooths over a lot. They flatten the messy networks of Arab, Persian, and Central Asian intermediaries, who had been moving between the Islamic world, India, and China for centuries. They gloss over other fragmentary hints of Europeans reaching Mongol courts, or at least hearing detailed reports about them, before Marco. They ignore the way his route is stitched together out of travel, service, second-hand accounts, and perhaps a few stretches that were never more than informed hearsay. Even his role at court expands in the European imagination. A man who in the text is presented as a trusted agent and messenger, probably useful because he is adaptable, observant, and multilingual, turns into a kind of informal minister or advisor or governor of cities. Some later retellings simply state that he was a high official of the Great Khan, as if he held some titled bureaucratic post recorded in imperial documents. There is no clear evidence of that. What we do have is a man who says he was employed on missions, sent to observe, to report, to carry orders, perhaps to negotiate. Useful work, but not the same as ruling provinces. The routes themselves get simplified. In the book, the journey to and from the Mongol world is a series of segments. Caravans break, regroup, change direction. Years pass at court before movement resumes. The homeward trip is by sea, tangled and slow. Later summaries pull all of this into a cleaner line. He goes east overland, spends many years at the Khan's side, then returns. The gaps, stays, and detours blur. It makes for a neater story. It also makes for a more extreme one, a single heroic arc, instead of a long, uneven commercial life embedded in larger patterns of movement. As Europe's relationship with China changes, the way people judge Marco's reliability shifts with it. In the 14th and 15th centuries, when direct European contact with East Asia is still minimal, his book is a rare and precious window. There is little else to check it against. Its authority rests as much on scarcity as on content. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Jesuit missionaries have spent decades in Ming and Qing courts. They write detailed letters. They publish maps, astronomical reports, grammars, and histories. They bring back a new vocabulary, China, as a single continuous civilization. The Chinese as representatives of a sophisticated, literate, bureaucratic state that can be praised or criticized according to European intellectual fashions. Now, when scholars read Marco, they do it with quite a different mental map in their heads. Some are delighted to find points of contact. They point to his descriptions of paper money, salt revenues, postal routes, and administrative practices, and say, you see, he was fundamentally accurate. Others fixate on the mismatches. Where is the Great Wall? Why does he not mention tea, porcelain, footbinding? Why do his province names not line up neatly with the ones the Jesuits bring back? Is this not proof that he never went, or that the book is mostly fiction? Arguments flare. The same text becomes, for some, confirmation that European observers had understood China centuries before the missionaries. For others, it becomes a convenient foil, a symbol of the vague, credulous medieval East, now corrected by precise, modern knowledge. Underneath the debate, something deeper is going on. Europe is not just reading Marco to learn about Yuan China anymore. It is reading Marco as a mirror. In times when China is admired as a model of rational administration or moral order, some readers see Marco as a wise, trustworthy reporter whose work fits that narrative. In times when China is dismissed as decadent, cruel, or stagnant, some readers see him as a half-legendary storyteller whose errors confirm their sense of distance and superiority. Even in the 19th century, when gunboat diplomacy and unequal treaties reshape the balance of power, Marco is repackaged again. This time he can be framed as a kind of precursor to modern imperial explorers, a man who opened up the East to the West. The fact that he did no such thing, that his book circulated for centuries before the voyages and conquests that really altered Asian-European relations, does not always get in the way of the myth. Some of these retellings end up in schoolbooks, popular histories, children's adaptations. They sink quietly into cultural memory. By the time you or I hear the name Marco Polo as children, it may come bundled with poolside games, cartoonish images of a lone man on a camel, and a vague sense that he'd discovered China for Europe. The layered, collaborative, sometimes uncertain text he left behind is hidden under that pile. Before we go on, a small, drowsy housekeeping note. If you like sinking into long, gentle stories like this, the channel's book is available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. You can think of it as another kind of travel companion, quieter than Marco's, but built from the same desire to wander through the past before sleep. When we talk about what Marco saw in China, all of this matters. There is the China he moved through, Mongol posts and river ports, tax offices and caravanserais, cities with names that changed as emperors did. There is the China he and Rusticello stitched together in a prison cell, part memory, part report, part borrowed marvel. And then there is the China that later Europe projected back onto his pages. Tidy routes, heroic roles, clean labels like First European II in the next part, when we try to sketch a plausible version of what he actually encountered. We have to keep those layers in mind. We are not just peeling back legend to find a pure, untouched core. We are looking at a palimpsest, a text written over many times, each generation adding its own marks. Some of those marks are his. Many belong to the centuries that came after. If you hold that in your mind softly, the question, what did he see, becomes less a test to pass or fail and more a slow, careful exercise in separating voices. His, theirs, and ours. If we strip the story down to its most solid parts, what remains is not a lone Venetian discovering a timeless China. It is a young merchant moving through the machinery of the Mongol world. Start with the frame that is hardest to deny. In the late 13th century, there really is a Mongol empire stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific. There really is a branch of Genghis Khan's family ruling in northern China, calling their dynasty Yuan. There really are postal stations, tax offices, caravan routes, seals of authority, and a court centred on Kublai Khan. There really are cities, huge ones by the standards of the time, on river plains and coastal estuaries, supplied by grain fleets and controlled by officials who answer to the Great Khan. And there really is a long tradition of Persian, Arab, and Central Asian intermediaries moving along these routes, trading, serving, observing. Marco's account fits into that picture. Not perfectly, not in every detail, but well enough that most historians think there must be a core of lived experience behind it. So if you try to imagine what he saw, you can begin there. He almost certainly saw the imperial relay system. In the book he describes the yam posts, stages where fresh horses, messengers and supplies are kept so that orders and envoys can move quickly. This matches what we know from Chinese and Persian sources. He names them, counts them, praises them. It sounds like the sort of infrastructure a merchant's son would notice and admire. He almost certainly saw large cities whose names we can, with some confidence, match to places on a modern map. His Kambalik is generally taken to be what would become Beijing. His Quinsai corresponds reasonably to Hangzhou, the former Song capital, famous then for its size and canals. He talks about Suzhou, Yangzhou, Fuzhou, and the great port of Zaitun, usually identified with Quanzhou in Fujian. The buildings he singles out, the palaces, the walls, the markets, the bridges, are exactly the kinds of things a visitor would notice in a city that dwarfed anything in Europe at the time. He likely saw court ceremony at some level. His description of Kublai's palace grounds with their hunting parks, seasonal processions and carefully staged appearances is theatrical but not absurd. It lines up with Chinese accounts that describe the same court as an arena of spectacle and ritual designed to make an impression on envoys. Marco's emphasis on banquets, gifts, and the visual display of power fits that pattern. He probably saw the workings of money and taxation in ways that surprised him. His description of paper currency backed by the authority of the Khan, made of bark, sealed and signed, compulsory for major transactions, feels like a memory of something strange that he needed to explain carefully to people back home. His long digressions on salt revenues and monopolies sound less like fantasy and more like a man fascinated, perhaps a little bewildered, by the way this empire extracts wealth. Those passages are dry by storytelling standards, yet they survived repeated copying. That persistence suggests that other merchants also found them useful. Around this core, more delicate layers begin. There are regions he probably reached not in person, but by report. He gives accounts of places far beyond any likely route, remote provinces of the Yuan, the coasts of India, islands of Southeast Asia. Some of these contain accurate kernels, real products, real political arrangements, real weather patterns wrapped in marvels and hearsay. These look like second-hand editions, the kind of thing a well-travelled man would have picked up from ship captains, Muslim traders, Mongol officials, and then folded into his dictated tale. There are also stretches that feel more like catalogues than memories. Lists of provinces with a repeated rhythm, each with so many cities, so many troops, so many marvels. Rustichello, the romance writer, would have been very comfortable with that structure. It is hard to know at this distance where Marco's recollection ends, and Rustichello's sense of how a good story should sound begins. Memory itself complicates everything. By the time Marco is dictating, years have passed since the experiences he describes. He is pulling from crowded mental shelves, markets, landscapes, conversations, all seen in quick succession while working, travelling, serving. Human memory does not store these as precise recordings. It stores patterns, striking images, fragments of dialogue, emotional impressions. When he speaks to Rustichello, those fragments get reassembled into continuous narratives. Little distortions creep in, distances stretch or compress. Two journeys made months apart slide together into one. The name of an official attaches itself to the wrong city. He might sincerely say, "I saw," when what he remembers is a detailed story told by a trusted informant, heard so often that it feels like his own. Then there is translation. Marco is speaking in a mixed, rough language, Venetian background, probably coloured by Persian and Mongol terms he picked up along the way. Rustichello is writing in a vernacular Franco-Italian, flavoured by his own habits and audience. Later scribes copy that, sometimes into Latin, sometimes into other tongues, smoothing unfamiliar sounds, replacing strange words with ones that make sense to them. Every step preserves a rough outline while nudging the details. A place whose name sounded like one thing in a Persian caravan might become something slightly different on the Genoese manuscript page, and something different again when retold in French. So what emerges from this process is not an exact transcript of a single observer's journey. It is a composite, not pure invention, not flawless reportage. If you imagine a spectrum with eyewitness diary written on the spot at one end and literary fiction spun from whole cloth at the other, Marco's travels sit somewhere in the wide middle. He appears to have travelled widely in the Mongol world. He appears to have served in some capacity that took him beyond a single city, sending him on missions and exposing him to administrative practices. He appears also to have been an eager collector of other people's stories, and to have allowed his own tale to be shaped by a professional storyteller and then by generations of copyists. For modern readers, one misunderstanding stands out. When we picture Marco's China, we often imagine a continuous Chinese civilization, interrupted briefly by foreign conquest, but essentially the same before, during, and after. We read his Cathay and Mangi as if they were just slightly off labels for a permanent China. But the world he moved through was Yuan-Mongol and networked. Northern and southern regions that Chinese dynasties had once ruled separately, were now integrated under a Mongol court that depended heavily on non-Chinese intermediaries, Central Asian Muslims, Tibetans, Persians, Turkic peoples. Relay stations, tax farms, and sea routes bound this space together. Marco's access to that world came through those networks. His China is not a self-contained civilization glimpsed in isolation. It is a node in a vast imperial web, buzzing with movement. That is why his pages jump so easily from northern plains to southern ports, from palace rituals to pearl fisheries. He is following the threads of an empire whose logic is connectivity. If you hold that picture softly, the book stops being a test we can only grade as true or false. It becomes instead a window onto a particular way of seeing, a Venetian merchant's son embedded in the Mongol system, a man whose attention is drawn to cities, revenues, routes, and ceremonies of power. A storyteller whose memories are filtered through another storyteller's pen. The value of that window is not that it gives us a perfect blueprint of Yuan China. Other sources, Chinese and Persian and archaeological, help us fill in many gaps and correct many slips. The value lies in the worldview it reveals, how a late medieval European, shaped by commerce and curiosity, made sense of a world-spanning empire that was, for a brief moment, open to him. In the last stretch of this story, we can let that realization settle. Marco's book is neither a miracle of accuracy nor a mere bundle of legends. It is one human thread woven into a much larger tapestry. If we read it gently with an eye for layers and for the networks behind his words, it can still carry us slowly toward a quieter kind of understanding. By now, his story may feel a little different in your mind. Not the clear, sharp path of a lone hero marching east, reporting faithfully on a fixed, timeless China, more like a layered reflection, rippling on the surface of a Mongol-era lake. When we look closely, his book is not a modern travel vlog, translated into medieval words. He isn't walking around with a camera, capturing everything evenly, from palaces to teacups, from walls to shoes. Instead, what we have is a dictated memory, tale from inside a Eurasian empire, shaped by routes and offices, taxes and courts, and then reshaped again by genre, by language, and by the expectations of the people who listened. Think of the numbers that once seemed so outrageous. The hundreds of bridges, the millions of households, the impossibly huge cities. We are no longer forced to choose between he lied and it was all literally true. We can hold a softer middle. His figures look like a mixture of awe, broken conversions, and conventional formulas. They are signals of scale, not exact statistics. He is trying to tell an audience that has never seen anything like Hangzhou that this place was vast, crowded and organized beyond their experience. If the numbers swell in the telling, they still point in the right direction. A world of urban density and imperial reach, far beyond what his listeners in Venice could imagine. Then there are the silences that used to trouble readers. No tea ceremony, no great wall as we picture it. No discussion of footbinding, few of the markers we now use to say, this is China. Those absences no longer have to mean, he never went. They can mean something quieter and more ordinary. He moved through a Mongol court where steppe practices sat alongside Chinese ones, where cavalry drills and paper money mattered more to him than how people flavoured their boiled water. He passed through regions where the wall was a crumbling, inherited structure, not yet rebuilt into the symbol it would become centuries later. He wrote, or rather spoke, for an audience that did not think in our categories. What we call tea culture was, for him, just one habit among many. What we call Chinese civilization was, for him, Cathay and Mangi Mongol provinces, tax bases, places folded into imperial circuits. The missing details tell us less about his honesty than about what counted as noteworthy in his world. We have also seen how the nature of the text itself bends the meaning of true. His book is not a diary. It is prison talk turned into romance prose, a merchant's recollections filtered through the narrative instincts of Rustichello, who knew how to pace a tale, how to group provinces into patterns, how to sprinkle in marvels where a medieval reader might expect them. Over time, copyists adjusted names, smoothed strange words, and sometimes nudged episodes toward the storytelling norms of their own day. The result is not a single pristine voice. It is a chorus humming around a central line of experience. Even translation plays its part in the layering. Every time a term passed from Mongolian to Persian, from Persian to a rough Italian, from that into Franco-Italian or Latin, and then into modern languages, it shifted a little. Place names blurred, titles for officials collapsed into approximations. Concepts that made sense inside a Yuan bureaucracy had to be recast in words that sounded familiar in a Mediterranean port. By the time we read Cathay and Mangi on a clean white page, we are far from the caravan dust and the crowded court halls where Marco once heard those names. And yet across all these distortions, something steady persists. A pattern of attention, to routes, to revenues, to stages along the imperial relay, to ceremonies designed to impress. A sense of moving through a web that stretches from the steppe to the sea. A human voice trying to make comprehensible a world that was, even then, already passing. That is the quieter truth behind the legend, not a fearless pathfinder mapping a frozen, eternal China, not a shameless fabulist spinning everything out of nothing. A working traveller inside the Mongol world, doing what travellers always do. Noticing what fits his interests, relying on guides, folding second-hand stories into first-person memories, allowing his tale to be shaped by the ears that surround him and the pen that writes for them. If you let that sink in, gently, another thought begins to surface. This is not just about Marco Polo. Every travel story you know, from medieval itineraries to glossy documentaries, is shaped by the same forces: audience, memory, genre, translation. Someone chooses what to leave out. Someone decides how big a number needs to be to convey huge. Someone smooths foreign names until they feel familiar. Someone forgets a detail and fills the gap with a guess that feels right. As you drift towards sleep, you might let one quiet question sit with you. When you imagine places you have never seen, whose stories are you really dreaming with? And if you told your own journey years from now, which parts would become crisp and solid, and which would dissolve into the soft mist of, I think I saw... If you've listened this far, thank you for keeping company with this old Venetian and his many layers. If you'd like more slow, careful history to fall asleep to, you can help this channel gently grow. You can like this video, subscribe and tap the little bell so new episodes find you when you're ready to rest. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. A city, a countryside, a ship at sea, whatever your corner of the map looks like. If the deep past we touched on earlier, bottlenecks, ancient migrations, the long, fragile thread of humanity, stirred your curiosity, there is more waiting for you. We've gathered those prehistoric secrets into a book written in the same calm, story-like voice, tracing how a few surviving lineages slowly became all of us. You can read more about it or pick up your own copy at sleepytimehistory.com. It's there whenever you feel like wandering further back, beyond empires and caravans, into the older, quieter landscape of our species. For now, you can let Marco's layered China and the soft creak of those caravan saddles fade into the background. There will be other journeys, other nights, other stories to unfold together. Let your thoughts loosen, like a road fading into darkness just beyond the last torch of a relay post. History will still be there in the morning. Tonight you can simply rest.